I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city, escape the constant noise, and spend a week alone in a remote cabin deep in the woods. I wanted peace, time to think, and the chance to be completely self-reliant. I wasn't looking for adventure or danger. I was looking for solitude, and maybe a little bit of quiet reflection. The cabin itself had been rented through a small online listing. Pictures showed a modest wooden structure with a porch, a stone fireplace, and a few small windows. It was set back from the road, surrounded by dense forest, and the nearest neighbor was at least a mile away. The owner assured me it was safe, and I assumed it would be. I had done everything right. I packed carefully, brought extra supplies, and made sure my phone was fully charged with a portable battery bank just in case. I even downloaded offline maps of the area. Still, when I finally arrived, after driving along a narrow dirt road and parking beside the cabin, a part of me felt a small, creeping unease that I couldn't quite place. The cabin was exactly as the photos showed: would age to a deep brown, a simple pitched roof, and a porch that creaked slightly when I stepped on it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and something earthy, almost damp. Dust settled lightly on the floorboards and counters, which told me the cabin hadn't been used for a while. I didn't mind. I liked the smell of old wood. I unpacked methodically. Food in the small pantry, clothes in the cupboard, and all my tools laid neatly on the kitchen counter. The first night, I lit the fireplace. The crackle of the fire was comforting. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, a soft, constant sound that made me feel both relaxed and alert at the same time. I went to bed early, listening to the forest and letting the quietness seep into my mind. The first few days passed without incident. I hiked during the day, exploring trails that wound through the forest, each trail looking more isolated than the last. I kept my phone handy but rarely used it. There was little signal. I kept track of time with a small wristwatch and wrote notes in a journal about my observations. The shape of the clouds, the tracks of animals, the patterns of birds I could hear but not see. The cabin itself became a sort of base, a place to clean up, rest, and prepare food. At night, I would light a small lantern and read by the fire, sometimes falling asleep to its warmth. Everything felt controlled and safe. I reminded myself that I had planned for emergencies, and yet, a small part of my mind remained alert, always aware of the sounds outside the windows. The unease began subtly on the fourth day. I had gone out to a nearby creek to refill my water bottle. The walk had been uneventful, and the water was clear and cold. As I stood on the edge, kneeling to fill the bottle, I thought I heard a snap in the underbrush behind me. It was quick, like a branch underfoot. I froze, listening. Nothing. Shrugging. I finished filling the bottle and returned to the cabin. I told myself it was just a deer or some small animal. Still, when I walked back through the forest, the sense that I was being watched made my skin crawl. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows that twisted strangely between the trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the shadows were long, dark, and seemingly alive. I tried to dismiss it as imagination, but the feeling lingered. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. Every little sound, the wind, a branch scraping, the distant rustle of leaves, made me sit up in bed, listening. I kept the door locked, even though it had a simple bolt, and checked the windows several times. I told myself it was rational precaution. Still, unease had crept into the edges of my mind. The fifth day, the feeling worsened. I had gone to a ridge not far from the cabin to watch the sunrise. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes the natural world feel suddenly vast and empty. On the way back, I found that one of the small paths I had marked in my map looked altered. There were broken twigs and footprints I didn't recognize. They were human footprints, too large to be from the people who maintained the trails. I followed them cautiously for a few moments before deciding not to pursue. The thought that someone else could be in the woods was unnerving. By the time I returned to the cabin, I noticed a subtle change. A branch had scratched against the side of the cabin that hadn't been there before, or maybe I hadn't noticed it. My mind tried to rationalize it as wind or animals, but even that felt off. I checked the perimeter carefully using a flashlight, circling the cabin twice. Everything looked normal. No footprints, no signs of recent human passage. I locked all the doors and windows again, making sure my knife and hatchet were close at hand. Nightfall that evening was tense. I built a larger fire in the fireplace and kept the cabin lights on. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the trees. Every noise, every rustle, made me tense. I forced myself to sit in a chair, trying to read, trying to focus on mundane things, but my heart was racing constantly. At one point, I thought I heard the sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I froze, listening intently. Nothing. I waited, tense and motionless, until the sound stopped completely. I checked the locks again. I stayed up for hours, fire crackling, sweat dampening my shirt from anxiety. The sixth day became critical. That morning, I decided to take a longer hike along a trail I hadn't explored yet. It wound up a hill and gave a view of the surrounding valley. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and insects. I tried to convince myself that the previous day's paranoia had been unnecessary, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But halfway up the hill, I noticed something unusual. Tire tracks on the narrow dirt path I had only walked before. They were fresh, and they were heading toward the cabin. My stomach sank. Someone had driven close enough to the cabin, possibly knowing it was occupied. My first thought was to return immediately, but the path was steep and narrow, and I needed to maintain my own safety as well. I turned and hurried back, adrenaline driving my steps. Every crackle in the leaves, every distant snap of a branch felt like a signal. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, I could see that the front porch looked undisturbed, yet the back of the cabin was partially hidden by trees. I hurried inside, checking all doors and windows. Everything was intact, but the presence of the tracks meant someone had been nearby. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could, stacking chairs against doors, keeping the fire going to give light, and making sure I had a clear view outside. That night, I slept lightly, in clothes, knife by my side, flashlight and battery close. Around midnight, I was awoken by a low sound outside, a scraping, like someone or something was moving near the cabin. My heart froze. I held my breath, listening. The sound persisted, slow and deliberate, moving along the side of the cabin. I couldn't see through the darkness, but the sound of boots crunching in gravel was unmistakable. I stayed silent, hoping it was someone passing by, maybe a hiker who had gotten lost. But the more I listened, the more deliberate the sound became. Whoever it was, they weren't moving quickly. They were pacing, examining the cabin. Panic rose inside me, sharp and hot. I checked the doors. Locked. Windows. Locked. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully edged toward the side window, shining the beam outside. There was nothing immediately visible, only darkness and shadow. But the tracks I had seen earlier were unmistakable. Someone had approached. I backed away slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. I stayed awake for hours, watching shadows and listening to any movement, until finally exhaustion took over and I dozed lightly. The seventh day, I realized I could not ignore the situation. I needed a plan to leave the area. The nearest road was a mile or so away, but I had no idea if anyone was still near the cabin. I packed all essentials: food, water, first aid, my backpack, flashlight, and knife. I also wrapped a small hatchet in a cloth for quick access. My plan was simple: leave quietly, move quickly along the forest trail, and reach the main road before anyone could spot me. I waited until the sun was higher, giving me enough light to see the path clearly. I checked all angles, then slipped out the back, moving slowly and deliberately along the underbrush. I avoided the areas closest to the cabin where I had seen tracks. My senses were on high alert. Every sound, every movement made me tense. Hours passed as I carefully made my way through the forest, occasionally crouching behind trees or rocks to hide from open sight. By mid-afternoon, I finally reached the dirt road leading back toward the main highway. I felt relief mixed with exhaustion. I walked briskly, checking constantly behind me, until I reached a small town a few miles away. From there, I called a cab to retrieve my car, not wanting to risk someone following me on foot. The sense of danger didn't completely leave, but I felt safe in populated areas again. Looking back, I realized how easily isolation can magnify fear. What started as a peaceful trip became a tense, almost survival-like experience. I learned to trust my instincts, to respect the forest and its unpredictability, and to prepare for situations I couldn't fully anticipate. The cabin itself was nothing sinister. It was the isolation, combined with another person potentially nearby, that turned normal noises and shadows into intense fear. Once I was back in the city, I tried to relax, but the experience stayed with me. I reinforced my decision. Next time, I would not go so deep into isolation without communication, and I would make sure to have a way to signal for help immediately. The forest was beautiful, yes, and the cabin was charming, but isolation, I realized, can make ordinary events feel threatening in ways I had never experienced before. I still think about the forest and the cabin sometimes. I remember the smell of damp wood, the sound of wind through the trees, the way shadows stretched across the cabin walls at night. It was a harsh, vivid lesson in awareness, preparation, and the limits of solitude. But I also learned something else. That fear, as raw and consuming as it can be, is manageable with careful planning, calm observation, and decisive action. In the end, I survived and I returned home. I cleaned and organized my gear, made notes about everything I had learned, and slowly began to process the experience. The cabin, the forest, and the moments of quiet terror had left a permanent imprint, but it was tempered by the clear sense of control I regained through careful, deliberate choices. I understood finally that the wilderness is neither cruel nor fair. It is simply indifferent. Survival, awareness, and preparation are what matter. And as long as I kept those lessons in mind, I knew I could face isolation again, though perhaps with a wiser, more cautious approach. I remember the first time I arrived at the cabin. It was early autumn, and the air carried that sharp, crisp edge that made everything feel alive, though also slightly foreboding. The cabin stood alone, deep in a forest I had never visited, miles from any town or road. I had rented it for a week to escape the noise of the city, to be alone, to breathe in silence without the constant buzz of cars or the intrusive light of street lamps. From the moment I parked my car on the dirt path that ended in a small clearing, I felt a mix of anticipation and unease. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built entirely from aged timber that had darkened over the years. The roof sagged slightly at the center, and moss had crept over some of the wooden shingles, giving it a slightly abandoned look. Yet it seemed solid, like it had endured decades of harsh weather without complaint. I unpacked slowly, carefully placing my bag on the old wooden floor. The interior smelled of aged wood, with faint hints of smoke and damp earth, a smell that was oddly comforting yet carried a weight of loneliness. Light filtered through the small, grimy windows, casting soft, muted beams across the floor. Outside, the forest seemed endless. Tall trees crowded in from all sides, their trunks close enough that I could almost touch them from the cabin doorway. The ground was covered with thick layers of fallen leaves, dry in some spots, damp and squishy in others. Small animals rustled through the underbrush, their movements sudden and sharp, reminding me that I was not completely alone. The first night passed quietly, though I barely slept. The wind whispered through the trees, making the cabin walls groan, and I kept imagining shapes moving just beyond the windows. I told myself it was normal, that I had read too many stories and let my imagination play tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I woke several times, convinced I had heard someone walking outside the cabin, but in the dim moonlight, all I could see were shadows moving with the sway of the trees. The following day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, a map, and my flashlight, though I told myself I wouldn't need it in daylight. The forest was denser than I expected, with narrow, barely discernible paths winding through thick groves of pine and oak. Birds called to one another from high branches, and occasionally, I would see a deer darting between the trees, freezing for a moment to look at me before disappearing again. The air was damp and cool, and every so often, the wind would pick up, carrying the earthy scent of the forest floor with it. I wandered farther than I had intended, following a small creek whose water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. The sound of the water was soothing, masking other noises, the snapping of twigs, the distant cry of a bird, or the soft rustle of leaves that might have been an animal or might have been nothing at all. By the time I turned back, the sun had dropped low, and the forest shadows were long and dark. Returning to the cabin, I noticed something strange. My small dirt path now seemed narrower, the trees closer together, almost pressing in. I shook my head and laughed softly to myself. It was probably just the fading light playing tricks on my eyes. That night, the unease grew. I tried to read, tried to distract myself with music, anything to silence the creeping thoughts. I had brought a small gas lantern and a stack of firewood. I spent hours getting the fire started, the sound of the flames crackling in the dark almost soothing, but also drawing attention to the fact that I was completely exposed, alone in the forest. I checked the locks on the doors several times. Everything seemed normal, yet every snap of a branch outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I told myself that I had to stay calm, that fear was the only danger. By the third day, my sense of isolation had intensified. I noticed small things I hadn't before, the way the wind sounded like distant footsteps when it passed through the trees, the occasional distant thud that made me freeze mid-breath, and the way the shadows in the cabin seemed to shift slightly even when the wind had stopped. I started keeping a knife by the bed, more out of habit than necessity, but it gave me a tiny sense of control. That afternoon, I decided to check the nearby ridge. The path was steep, with loose stones and exposed roots, and I had to be careful with each step. Reaching the top, I could see the full expanse of the forest, a sea of green and brown stretching endlessly in every direction. The cabin looked small from above, almost insignificant in the vast wilderness. Yet as I stood there, I noticed movement at the edge of my vision. A figure, perhaps a person, moving among the trees far below. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced, but I told myself it was a trick of light and shadow, perhaps a deer or another animal. Returning to the cabin, I decided to double-check my supplies. Food was limited, and water from the creek needed boiling. As I moved around, stacking wood and inspecting the cabin structure, I heard it, a faint scratching at the back door. I froze. It wasn't loud, not enough to be certain, but enough to make my pulse quicken. Slowly, I approached the door, knife in hand, and peered through the small window. Nothing. The forest was silent except for the rustling leaves. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing against the door, but sleep that night was impossible. The next morning, I woke early, still exhausted, and decided to hike to the main road to see if I could get cell service. I needed to check in with someone, anyone, just to know I was still connected to the outside world. The hike was long and arduous, the undergrowth thick, the dirt path slippery with wet leaves from the night's dew. Hours passed, and when I finally reached the road, I had no service. Nothing. My phone displayed only the spinning, searching icon. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. Being completely cut off from the world was one thing when it was optional, but quite another when it was imposed. Back at the cabin, I started noticing signs that made my skin crawl. Footprints in the soft dirt around the cabin that weren't mine. Small branches bent in unnatural ways. The subtle scent of something unfamiliar in the air, earthy, but sharp and metallic. I kept telling myself it was an animal, a bear or a deer, perhaps someone else hiking nearby. But there were no trails leading to the cabin from anywhere visible, and I was certain no one else had the address or knew where the cabin was. That night, the wind picked up, stronger than any I had felt before. The trees bent under its force, and the cabin groaned with each gust. I kept the fire going, stacked extra logs around the hearth, and listened. There was movement outside, deliberate, slow, almost cautious. I could hear it circling, pausing, then moving again. My mind raced. Whoever it was, they knew I was here. I considered leaving, but my car was parked far below the ridge, and the path down in the dark would be treacherous, especially if someone was waiting. Morning brought no relief. I inspected the cabin thoroughly, checking every door and window. Everything was still intact, but signs of intrusion were undeniable. Footprints pressed into the soft soil near the back, small scuffs on the door frame, and the lingering scent of smoke. Not mine, unfamiliar smoke that smelled like burnt leaves and something acrid. I realized, slowly and with growing dread, that someone had been inside while I slept. They hadn't taken anything, but they had been there, watching, waiting. The following day was tense, every sound amplified. I rationed my food, kept water boiling constantly, and moved cautiously around the cabin. Any moment outside felt like a gamble, each shadow potentially hiding another person. I couldn't see anyone, but the signs were everywhere. The broken twigs, footprints, subtle noises. The isolation that had initially felt peaceful now weighed heavily, oppressive and threatening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the fear became almost unbearable. I decided to spend the night fully prepared, blocking doors, barricading windows with furniture, keeping the fire blazing. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump, each time expecting an intruder to appear. Hours passed slowly, the darkness pressing in around me. Sleep was impossible, but eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I dozed lightly, my knife clutched in one hand. I awoke suddenly to a loud crash. Something had hit the cabin wall with force. My heart jumped into my throat, adrenaline surging, and I scrambled to the nearest window. Outside, in the moonlight, I saw nothing at first. Then, in the shadows beyond the tree-line, movement. A figure crouched, watching, disappearing quickly into the dark. I realized the intruder had been observing me all along, timing their moves, testing my response. Panic surged, but I forced myself to act calmly. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, grabbing my essentials: knife, flashlight, backpack, food, water. I decided to take the steep path down to my car, moving as quietly and cautiously as possible, knowing any sudden sound could draw attention. Each step was tense, careful, the loose stones threatening to betray me. Shadows shifted around me, but I kept moving, forcing my mind to focus on survival rather than fear. Finally, I reached my car, drenched in sweat and trembling, the headlights cutting through the dark like a beacon. I locked the doors behind me, sat for several minutes, and listened. There was no one, no movement, just the distant sounds of the forest at night, natural and indifferent. I started the engine, the hum of the motor oddly comforting, and drove the winding dirt path back to the main road, my eyes scanning the shadows constantly. When I finally reached a town with lights and people, the relief was overwhelming. I stopped at a small diner to collect my thoughts, ordered a large coffee, and sat staring out the window, hands trembling, realizing just how isolated I had been. The cabin was still out there, deep in the forest, alone but not empty. Someone had been watching, silent and patient, leaving only subtle signs but enough to terrify. I never went back. I never wanted to return. Even now, months later, I think about the cabin sometimes. I picture the trees, the shadows, the feeling of being observed, knowing that out there, in that silent, dark forest, someone or something was patient enough to wait, watching a lone person in isolation. The memory sends a shiver through me, but I also know that I survived because I stayed calm, because I noticed the small details, because I acted deliberately. It was terrifying, yes, but in the end, it reinforced something important. Awareness, caution, and quick thinking are the only real protection when you are completely alone in a wild place. And the relief of finally seeing lights, people, civilization again, that is the most vivid, unforgettable reward of all. I had been looking forward to the weekend for weeks. The idea of getting away from the city, the noise, the people, and the constant pressure at work was too tempting to resist. I found a cabin online that seemed perfect. Remote, isolated, nestled deep in the woods, with a small creek nearby and a clearing that promised sunlight in the mornings. The pictures were rustic but charming. The reviews were sparse, but the few I read were positive. I packed carefully, Food for 2 days, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a small portable stove, blankets, water, and a map of the area. I wanted to be self-sufficient and prepared because the whole point of going to the cabin was to escape, not to rely on anyone else. I left the city early Friday morning, driving the winding roads that led out of town and into the hills. As the city disappeared behind me, replaced by dense forests and rising terrain, I felt a light thrill of anticipation. The air was cooler here, cleaner, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. I had driven for nearly 3 hours before I noticed the gravel road that, according to the map, led to the cabin. It was narrow, uneven, and lined with thick trees on either side. The deeper I went, the more I realized how isolated the place really was. No other cars, no houses, just the sound of my tires crunching over gravel and the occasional bird or rustle of small animals. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked just like it did in the photos. It was a small, wooden structure with a steep roof, a chimney that hinted at a working fireplace, and windows that reflected the surrounding trees. There was a small porch, and I noticed a woodpile neatly stacked to one side. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of solitude settle around me. There was a strange quiet that was heavier than any silence I'd experienced in the city. No distant traffic, no planes overhead, no neighbors. Just the faint babble of the creek and the wind through the trees. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The smell of wood and something faintly musty hit me immediately. Dust had settled on surfaces, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. It wasn't uncomfortable, just real, authentic. I set down my bag and took a careful walk through the cabin. There was a small kitchen area, a living room with a fireplace, and a single bedroom. The bathroom was tiny but functional. There were basic supplies, matches, some cleaning supplies, and canned food left behind by the owner. Nothing fancy, nothing modern. It was exactly what I wanted. Simple and isolated. I decided to unpack slowly, taking my time to settle in. I arranged my food and water, stacked my blankets neatly on the bed, and checked the flashlight and stove. Once that was done, I went outside to explore the clearing and the creek. The water was clear, running cold over smooth stones, and I dipped my hand in, feeling its icy edge. The clearing opened up a little beyond the cabin, revealing a small patch of sunlight and a few scattered wildflowers. Birds called from the trees, and I could hear squirrels moving through the underbrush. Everything felt peaceful, and I imagined spending the night there with a fire and no one around to disturb me. By late afternoon, I had gathered some firewood and started a small fire in the fireplace. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, and I sat nearby, sipping water and feeling a rare sense of calm. But as the sun sank lower, a subtle unease crept in. The forest grew darker, the shadows longer and denser. Sounds I hadn't noticed before, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, suddenly seemed louder and closer. I reminded myself that I was in the wilderness, that animals moved around constantly, and that this was normal. Still, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, a tension that wouldn't leave. Night fell quickly. The cabin was lit only by the fire and the weak light of my flashlight, which I had left on the table. I tried to read a book, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, to the dark shapes of trees outside. The wind had picked up, rattling the roof and shaking the branches against the sides of the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard something walking outside, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed too steady to be a small animal. I froze, straining my ears, but the sound stopped. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. Still, I made sure the door was locked and the windows closed tight. I slept fitfully that night, waking every hour or so to strange noises outside. Sometimes it was a snap of a branch, sometimes a low thud against the side of the cabin. I convinced myself each time that it was an animal, deer, raccoon, maybe a bear, but in the pit of my stomach, a small voice whispered that something wasn't right. Morning came slowly, gray and damp. A light fog hung over the clearing, and the creek ran low and silver in the muted light. I stepped outside, trying to shake off the tension from the night. As I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Faint footprints in the soft earth near the edge of the clearing. They weren't large, not the size of a bear, but definitely human. My heart skipped. I scanned the tree line, but I couldn't see anything. Whoever it was had been careful to stay out of sight, but the tracks were clear evidence that I was not alone. I went back inside, my mind racing. I debated leaving immediately, but the nearest town was over 2 hours away, and the gravel road was treacherous in the fog. I decided to stay, but I prepared. I stacked firewood near the door, kept the flashlight in my hand, and made sure the knife I had brought for camping was within reach. I checked the windows, ensuring all locks were secure. For the rest of the day, I kept busy, collecting more wood, filling containers with water from the creek, and trying to keep my mind focused on practical tasks rather than fear. As night fell again, the tension returned, stronger than before. The sounds outside were more frequent. Something moving among the trees, a low scraping against the cabin walls. I stayed close to the fire, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. Hours passed like this, each minute stretching endlessly. Then I heard it clearly, a deliberate knock on the door. Slow, heavy, almost rhythmic. My breath caught. I did not move, not daring to show myself. The knocking continued, punctuated by long pauses. Whoever it was knew I was inside. I stayed frozen, listening. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, dragging sound outside, like someone moving something heavy across the ground. I considered escaping through the back door, but that would mean exposing myself to whoever or whatever was out there. My mind raced, considering every possible scenario, every potential danger. I remembered the flashlight I had left on the table and the extra batteries. I also remembered the knife. I had to stay calm. Hours passed, maybe an eternity. I kept the fire alive, moving wood and stirring embers, trying to create as much light and warmth as possible. At some point, the noises outside faded. Exhausted, I tried to sleep in the chair near the fire, keeping the knife under my hand and the flashlight beside me. I slept lightly, dreams full of shadows and movement, waking to every creak and whisper of the cabin. Morning light eventually broke through the fog, and with it came clarity. I cautiously stepped outside, inspecting the perimeter. The human footprints were still there, now clearer in the morning mud. They led around the cabin but stopped abruptly near a cluster of trees. There were no signs of who had made them or why. I realized I had been lucky. Someone had been close, but for some reason, they had left. I didn't wait to find out why. I packed my belongings quickly, took one last look at the cabin, and left. The drive back was tense, every shadow along the road making me flinch. When I finally reached the main highway and the familiar signs of civilization, relief washed over me. I thought about calling the authorities, but without knowing who or what had been outside, there was little they could do. The experience stayed with me long after, a reminder of how vulnerable one can be in isolation, how the silence of the wilderness can hide real, human dangers, and how easily the mind can convince itself of safety until confronted with reality. I never returned to that cabin. Weeks later, I looked it up online and saw that it had been rented again, but I couldn't bring myself to visit or even think about it without feeling a chill. I realized that the story of that weekend was not about ghosts or legends. It was about being truly alone in a place where someone else could be watching, waiting, and moving unseen. It was about realizing that danger doesn't need to announce itself with dramatic signs. It can exist quietly, close enough to touch, and you might never know why or how it ends. And in the end, the only way I survived was through caution, preparedness, and an acute awareness of every sound, shadow, and movement around me. That realization was frightening, but it was also empowering. I learned that survival, even in a place that looks safe and peaceful, depends on constant vigilance, careful observation, and respect for the unknown that is not supernatural, but human. I remember the drive to the cabin clearly, though I would never have guessed how much that day would change my sense of security and patience with nature. I had planned this trip for months, thinking of it as an escape from the endless hum of city life, the traffic, the lights, and the constant push of responsibilities that never seemed to end. The cabin was supposed to be simple, isolated, a place where I could breathe freely and feel like time itself had slowed. The GPS guided me down a long stretch of highway that gradually thinned into forested roads, paved at first, then gravel, then eventually dirt that shifted under my tires and kicked up clouds of dust. I had packed enough supplies for a week, though I knew I might not need them all. There were 2 large backpacks, filled with dry food, canned goods, and bottles of water. I had a small camping stove and extra fuel, a first aid kit, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a backup lantern. I had a few books, notebooks, and pens, thinking that solitude would give me clarity, though I underestimated just how alive the forest could feel, how much it demanded attention even when I thought I was alone. The cabin itself came into view as I followed the winding dirt path that threaded through the thick forest. It was small, built from logs with a pitched roof and a stone chimney. Moss and small plants clung to the wood, evidence that it had been there for decades, untouched by modernity. Its windows were small and dusty, reflecting the dim light of the late afternoon sun. I parked my car near a narrow clearing and stepped out, inhaling deeply. The air was heavy with the scent of wet pine and decomposing leaves. The forest was quiet, but in that quiet I could hear everything. The soft creak of trees swaying, the distant chatter of birds, the scurrying of small animals across the forest floor. I grabbed my supplies and walked to the cabin door, which I had to push open with some effort. It stuck slightly on the frame, but eventually swung inward with a hollow groan. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and old stone. Dust motes floated in the slanting light through the window. It was exactly as described in the rental photos, simple, basic, and entirely isolated. There was a small kitchen area, a few cabinets, a stove that looked like it hadn't been used in months, a sink with an old faucet, and a shelf with a few mismatched dishes. The living area was dominated by a large fireplace, blackened from years of use. 2 small bedrooms were off to the sides, each with a single bed, and a small bathroom in the corner. The cabin was functional but far from luxurious. It had no electricity apart from a small generator I knew was in the shed outside, no Wi-Fi, and no cell signal. I didn't mind. In fact, the idea of being cut off from the world was part of why I had chosen this place. I spent the first hour unpacking, arranging my supplies, making the beds, and preparing the small kitchen. I took a moment to light a fire in the fireplace, testing the chimney and the flue, and I watched as the flames licked the logs, throwing flickering shadows on the walls. The first night fell quickly. The forest had a way of amplifying darkness, turning shadows into shapes that made my chest tighten even when I knew I was alone. I slept in short stretches, waking often to the sound of branches scraping against the cabin walls or the distant cry of an animal I couldn't identify. My mind tried to rationalize everything: the wind, the movement of deer or raccoons, but the unfamiliarity gnawed at me. I realized quickly that even without supernatural elements, the forest itself could create fear. The soundscape of the night, the rustle of leaves, the cracking of twigs, the distant calls, was enough to make me tense and alert. By the morning, I was both exhausted and alive in a way the city never allowed. Every sense felt heightened. I could hear the drip of water from the eaves, smell the damp earth outside, feel the uneven boards under my bare feet. The first few days passed without incident, though each day felt long and deliberate. I explored the immediate surroundings, mapping paths and noting landmarks. I found a small stream nearby, its water clear and cold, and I used it to supplement my bottled water, boiling it to be safe. I set up a small clearing for a campfire outside, away from the cabin, and spent hours stacking wood, ensuring it would last. I noticed animal tracks near the cabin: deer, raccoons, and once a set of larger prints that I guessed belonged to a bear, though I saw no sign of it beyond the tracks. I kept food in secure containers and avoided leaving scraps outside. Every evening, I would light the fireplace and watch the smoke curl into the chimney. The nights were always long. The wind often picked up, rattling the cabin and shaking branches, making me jump even though I was alone. The forest was alive, breathing, watching in its own way. I became hyper-aware of every noise, the scratch of a branch against a window, the distant howl of a coyote, the flapping of birds startled from their nests. The isolation magnified everything, made the ordinary feel dangerous. On the fourth night, things began to change. I had gone to bed later than usual, reading by the fire until the flames were low. Sleep came slowly, my mind restless. Around midnight, I was awakened by a noise outside, soft, deliberate, like someone walking in the clearing near the cabin. My first reaction was rational. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or a raccoon. But as I listened, I realized the steps were heavier than any animal I knew. They weren't constant but intermittent, moving closer and farther from the cabin. My heart raced. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear, trying to convince myself that nothing could happen, that I was safe in this isolated cabin. But the sound continued, moving in patterns that didn't make sense for an animal. At one point, I thought I heard the brush of something against the cabin wall, a faint tapping, like nails on wood. I froze. My rational brain fought to override the rising panic. I checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. The padlock on the door was secure, and the windows were latched. I kept a flashlight on the bedside table and my phone close, even though it had no signal. I told myself I would wait it out, that no one could reach me without making themselves known. But the noise didn't stop. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch, every creak of the cabin amplified into an unknown threat. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in bed with the flashlight on, pointing toward the window, listening to the forest outside. Around 3 in the morning, the sound of heavy footsteps stopped abruptly. Silence returned, oppressive and unnatural. I didn't move for an hour, straining to hear any sound that might give me an indication of what had been there. Finally, just before dawn, I dozed off, waking later to the sun spilling through the dusty windows. The outside looked peaceful, birds chirping, the stream glinting, the trees swaying gently. I tried to rationalize the previous night. Maybe it had been a hiker or hunter, though I hadn't seen a single car on the dirt road. Maybe a bear had walked unusually close, though that seemed unlikely given its cautious nature. I convinced myself it was a fluke, an anomaly, a trick of my mind heightened by isolation and fatigue. But the feeling lingered, the sense that the forest had noticed me in a way I hadn't noticed it before. The following days, I took extra precautions. I reinforced the windows, piled rocks and heavy logs near the perimeter, and kept the fire outside lit in the clearing. I avoided traveling too far from the cabin, keeping all my meals and supplies inside. I started to notice more subtle things. Branches snapped in ways that didn't align with wind or animals, footprints that didn't belong to any wildlife I knew, marks on trees that could have been made by claws or tools. My imagination raced, fueled by the memory of the footsteps. I began to question the cabin itself. Had someone stayed there before me? Were the previous occupants careful? Or had they left traps or hazards? I walked the perimeter daily, checking for signs of human presence. Each day I found nothing conclusive, but each night brought that lingering anxiety back. On the 7th night, everything came to a head. I was alone, the forest quiet, and the moon had risen high, casting a silver glow through the trees. Around 11, I heard it again. Footsteps, heavier and more deliberate than before, circling the cabin in no discernible pattern. My heart pounded. I checked the doors and windows, ensured everything was locked, and grabbed my camping axe, keeping it close. I stayed in the living room, flashlight in hand, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. Then I heard it, the subtle sound of scraping, of something being dragged along the ground outside. I forced myself to stay calm. My mind raced through all possibilities. Someone could be out there trying to intimidate me, testing the cabin's security. The forest seemed alive with anticipation, every leaf trembling, every branch vibrating in response. I felt trapped, helpless, and infinitely exposed at the same time. Hours passed. I stayed crouched, listening, waiting, and finally, just before dawn, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep. The first light of morning revealed tracks in the soil outside. a large pair of boot prints, and beside them, deeper scrapes that suggested something heavy had been dragged. The prints led away from the cabin toward the forest, but they did not vanish completely. They circled the cabin, returned toward the road, and disappeared into the undergrowth. I examined them carefully, noting size, depth, and spacing. They were clearly human, and whoever had been outside had moved with intention. My sense of relief was muted by the knowledge that they could have been back at any moment. I packed lightly, ate a small breakfast, and waited until the sun rose higher before venturing out. I needed to get back to civilization. I returned to my car, packed everything carefully, and checked the surrounding area one last time. Nothing moved in the forest. No eyes peered at me, no sounds approached. The drive back to the highway was tense, every shadow along the dirt road making me flinch. I drove quickly but safely, keeping the cabin behind me in the rearview mirror. When I reached the main road, the sense of normalcy slowly returned. The trees gave way to open fields, the air smelled less pungent, and the distant hum of traffic reminded me that other humans were nearby. I stopped at a small gas station, bought water, and sat outside for a long time, letting the sunlight warm me. I realized I had been lucky. No one had confronted me directly, no harm had come, yet the threat had been very real. My sense of security had been shattered, and I knew I would never return to that cabin. The experience changed me. I learned how vulnerable I could feel in isolation, how the ordinary environment of a forest could turn into a subtle, constant threat, and how my own mind could amplify fear in the absence of explanation. Weeks later, I returned home and examined the photos I had taken of the cabin and surroundings. In one, I noticed faint markings on a tree I hadn't seen before, scratches too straight and organized to be natural, evidence that someone had been there recently, likely observing the cabin, maybe even planning. I never reported it. The authorities would have dismissed it as nothing, and I didn't want to go back. But the memory stayed with me. The long, silent nights, the footsteps circling the cabin, the dragging sounds in the dark, the way the forest had seemed to close in and watch. The story ended with me safe, alive, and having escaped a very real danger, but it left a deep impression. Fear does not require ghosts, and isolation can be the most terrifying presence of all. It had been months since I had taken a proper break from the city. Work, endless emails, meetings, and deadlines had left me exhausted in a way I hadn't noticed until I actually stopped moving for a moment. My mind was constantly busy, always thinking of the next thing, always planning. I needed to escape, and I needed silence. That was how I found myself driving through winding, nearly empty roads in the northern countryside, somewhere I barely knew, headed toward a small cabin that I had rented for a week. The GPS signal was weak, and after the first hour, I realized I wasn't going to be following precise directions anymore. The road narrowed into a dirt track, and the trees seemed to close in on either side, their long branches scraping the sides of my car. My heart was a little tense, not from fear exactly, but from awareness. This kind of isolation felt different from any city quiet I had ever known. The cabin appeared after another 20 minutes of driving, almost as if it had been hidden behind a fold in the land. It was small, simple, made of logs, with a porch that sagged slightly at one corner. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, suggesting life, but I remembered that the listing said it was unoccupied until my arrival. I parked my car on a flat clearing nearby and stepped out, stretching my back. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and damp earth. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground as I walked up to the porch and unlocked the door. The interior was dim, lit only by the thin rays of light filtering through the windows. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by my movement. Everything smelled faintly of wood, of old furniture, of a place that had been closed for a while but not abandoned. I felt a brief moment of comfort. This was exactly what I had wanted. Solitude, silence, a place to breathe. I set down my bag and began exploring. The cabin had a single bedroom, a living area with a small wood stove, a kitchen corner with basic supplies, and a bathroom that looked functional but aged. There were a few scattered items left behind, An old kettle on the stove, a chipped mug in the cabinet, a stack of newspapers that were at least a month old. I brushed them off and made a mental note to clean a little before settling in. I also noticed the heavy lock on the door, the kind that might give a person a sense of safety or unease depending on their mood. I chose to take it as reassuring. I was here to disconnect, not worry about threats. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The first night passed quietly. I had a simple dinner, lit a small fire in the stove, and read a book by the dim light, feeling the tension of city life slowly leave my shoulders. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the occasional owl hooted somewhere in the distance. It was the kind of quiet that presses in around you, making every sound, every branch snapping, every leaf brushing against another, seem louder than it would in a populated area. I fell asleep feeling strangely relaxed, the kind of sleep where you aren't entirely conscious of the time passing but know your body is finally getting rest. Morning came, and with it, the usual forest sounds. Birds calling, the faint rustle of squirrels moving through the trees, and the soft trickle of a stream I had seen on the map nearby. I decided to explore the area a little. I strapped on my boots, grabbed a small backpack with water and some snacks, and left the cabin, moving along the narrow dirt paths between the thick trees. It was beautiful in an almost overpowering way. The forest felt alive, but also patient and unmoving. As I walked, I tried to note landmarks to ensure I wouldn't get lost. There were fallen logs, rocks with strange moss patterns, and occasional clearings where the sunlight spilled through like a spotlight. I felt good being out there, breathing fresh air, feeling the slight chill of early morning against my skin. Around midday, I found a clearing that overlooked a small valley. The view was astonishing, almost cinematic. I took a few photos with my phone and sat down on a large rock to eat a small lunch. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I had read that isolation in the forest can make ordinary noises sound threatening if your mind starts to wander, and I felt a slight tension settle in my chest, though I pushed it aside. I decided to head back to the cabin before the sun dipped too low. On my way back, I noticed the dirt track where I had come in, and that was when I realized the feeling I had pushed aside earlier. Something felt off. There was a subtle difference in the air, a faint scent, almost like smoke, but not from a fire. I paused and looked around, scanning the trees for movement. Nothing. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind carrying smells from far away. By the time I reached the cabin, I tried to laugh at my own nerves. That night, as I prepared dinner, I heard a sound outside. It was a soft crunch on the dirt, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I checked the door locks, reassuring myself they were all secure. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. There had been deer tracks nearby during my morning walk, and the forest was full of animals. I tried to ignore it and went to bed, but sleep was not easy. Every little sound made me flinch. The wind through the trees, a branch snapping somewhere nearby, a distant thud that could have been a falling tree or something else entirely. By the time dawn came, I was tired in a way that only a night of half sleep and constant tension can create. The following day, I decided to venture farther, carrying a map and marking my route carefully. I wanted to see a small stream that the cabin host had mentioned, which was supposed to be ideal for fishing. The morning air was crisp, the forest alive with the subtle energy of animals going about their day. I kept thinking about the noises from the previous night, but the sunlight and the normalcy of the surroundings helped to ease my mind. The path became rougher as I went deeper, with fallen branches and uneven ground making every step deliberate. I noticed animal tracks, deer, foxes, maybe raccoons, and I felt reassured by their presence. At least this part of the forest was inhabited by animals and not people, I thought. When I reached the stream, it was more beautiful than I expected. The water was clear, moving steadily over smooth stones, reflecting sunlight in a pattern that felt almost hypnotic. I sat by the edge, rested my pack against a tree, and took off my boots to feel the cold water on my feet. It was calming, soothing in a way that city life never was. I spent a few hours there, sketching the scenery in a small notebook I had brought, taking photos and just watching the flow of water. But as the sun began to lower in the sky, I realized I needed to return to the cabin before darkness fell. The woods could be unforgiving at night if you didn't know your surroundings. The return trip was quieter than the morning. The forest seemed heavier, shadows longer, and the path harder to navigate. At some point, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. My landmarks didn't match the map, and my usual signs, the fallen tree, the mossy rock, were nowhere to be seen. I paused, trying to orient myself. The sun was beginning to set, and a cold wave of panic started to settle in. I wasn't entirely lost, but I wasn't sure of the path. My mind raced through options. Follow the stream back, try to retrace steps, stay put and wait. I knew staying put would be foolish. Darkness came fast in the forest, and temperatures were dropping. I decided to trust my instincts and move in what I thought was the right direction, using the setting sun to guide me west, back toward the cabin's general location. Hours passed. The path seemed endless. Every sound made me flinch. A branch snapping, a rustle in the undergrowth, even the faint hoot of an owl. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the trees, a shadow darting between trunks, but it could have been nothing more than the wind playing tricks with leaves. My legs were sore, my energy waning, and the idea of spending the night in the open became more real with every step. By the time darkness fully fell, I was cold, tired, and increasingly aware that I might not reach the cabin without help. I dug my flashlight out of my pack, trying to steady my breathing as I pressed on. Then I heard it, a voice, human, low and indistinct, coming from somewhere ahead. My heart jumped. I froze, listening carefully. There was a pause, then another sound, footsteps moving, but different from mine. They were deliberate, following me. I tried to tell myself it could be another hiker, maybe someone else staying in the area, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a weight. My pace quickened, but so did the footsteps behind me. I realized the direction I had been heading might not be leading me toward safety. Panic started to creep in. My mind went through options. Run blindly, try to climb a tree and wait, make noise to scare them off. None of it felt right. The forest around me felt alive, closing in, every sound magnified in the dark. I remembered the cabin, the safety it promised, and pushed forward with everything I had left. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint glow through the trees. The cabin. Relief washed over me in a way I didn't realize I had been denying myself. I sprinted the last few dozen meters, practically tripping over roots and rocks, and reached the porch. I slammed the door shut behind me, locked it, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. My hands shook uncontrollably. The feeling of being alone, and yet followed, disappeared with the solid walls of the cabin around me. I sat on the floor, back against the door, and let the adrenaline fade slowly. I lit the stove, made a hot drink, and checked every lock and window. Nothing was out of place, and yet the memory of footsteps in the dark stayed with me. Over the next few days, I stayed mostly inside, only venturing short distances during daylight. I cleaned the cabin thoroughly, organized my supplies, and kept a strict routine. I started keeping a journal, noting every small sound I heard, every detail about the forest. I realized the danger wasn't supernatural. It was real and human, or at least potentially human. The isolation itself was the threat. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone, but the idea that someone could be nearby, unseen, was enough to make me cautious. I stayed alert at all times, carrying a small knife and keeping my phone charged, even though the signal was weak. I reinforced the doors and windows as best as I could and made sure the firewood was stacked where I could access it quickly if needed. The fear slowly changed into a careful vigilance, a knowledge that I was responsible for my own safety. By the end of the week, I had learned to navigate the area carefully. I had identified safe paths, places to avoid, and routines to reduce risk. I realized that the forest wasn't friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. It simply existed, indifferent. My time in the cabin had changed me in subtle ways. I felt more aware, more attuned to small details, and more appreciative of human life and safety. The day I left, I packed my belongings carefully, double-checked the locks, and took one last look at the cabin. The sun was bright, and the forest seemed peaceful, almost inviting in the daylight. I felt a deep sense of relief and a small pride. I had faced the isolation, the fear, and the very real danger of being alone in a remote place, and I had come out intact, wiser, and more cautious. Driving back down the dirt track, the trees thinning, the roads widening, I thought about how fragile safety can feel, how isolation can reveal both fear and strength, and how even a simple cabin in the woods can become a place of lessons and survival. I never saw anyone follow me, never discovered a clear reason for the sounds at night, but the experience stayed with me. It stayed in the tension of my muscles, in the way I checked locks more than I used to, in the careful attention to surroundings that became second nature. And in that, I found the clarity I had been looking for. Not escape from life, but understanding how fragile and precious it is. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After a grueling few weeks at work, I needed a break. Somewhere far away from the city, away from people, away from the constant hum of lights and screens and noise. The idea of spending a week alone in a cabin in the woods seemed perfect. I found it online. A small, rustic cabin tucked away in a state forest, miles from the nearest town. The pictures were old, but the reviews were positive. It had electricity, running water, and a fireplace. Nothing fancy, nothing modern, just a quiet place to be alone with the forest. I packed my car carefully, double-checking every essential. Food, water, first aid kit, tools, flashlight, spare batteries, blankets, a small camping stove, and enough firewood for the week. I didn't plan to leave the cabin much, but I wanted to be prepared. I had maps printed out, a compass, and even a small handheld radio, though I knew reception would be weak. I told myself that being self-sufficient would make the experience peaceful, even meditative. The drive to the cabin was long. The roads narrowed as I went deeper into the forest. Tall pines lined the route, shadows stretching over the asphalt, turning the world into a tunnel of green. Birds called occasionally, and the wind rustled the branches. First, it was relaxing, almost hypnotic. I watched the sunlight flicker through the leaves, and I felt like I was leaving the world behind. But after a few hours, the isolation started to press in on me. I realized I had not seen another car in almost an hour. The thought of being completely alone was strange, almost thrilling, but also faintly unnerving. When I finally reached the cabin, I was relieved. It was even smaller than I had imagined, but that was fine. It had a porch, a tiny kitchen, one main room with a wood stove, a small bathroom, and a loft with a bed. Everything smelled faintly of wood polish and something else I couldn't identify. It was not unpleasant, but it reminded me that people had been here before, that the cabin was not untouched wilderness. I spent the first few hours unpacking and organizing. I stacked firewood neatly near the stove, checked the plumbing, and made sure the stove worked. Then I prepared a simple dinner. Canned beans heated on the stove, bread, and water. I ate slowly, appreciating the silence. There was no hum of electricity, no engines, no chatter. Just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the distant rustle of the trees. That first night, I went to bed early, listening to the forest and thinking how peaceful it was. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. I brewed coffee over the stove and sat on the porch watching the mist lift from the forest floor. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the smell of damp leaves and pine needles. Birds flitted between the trees, and a squirrel scampered along a branch. I felt calm, almost restored. I spent the day exploring the small area around the cabin, making mental notes of landmarks. The creek a quarter-mile east, the rocky hill to the west, a fallen tree that looked like a bridge. Everything was familiar and safe. That evening, I started a fire in the stove, feeling the warmth spread through the room. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and shaking the porch boards. I felt a slight tension in my chest. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself the wind was normal, the sounds natural. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every snapping twig outside made me sit up, alert. My mind kept thinking of things. Animals, accidents, getting lost if I wandered too far. But by morning, I had drifted off in a restless, fitful sleep. The next few days passed in a similar rhythm. I woke early, explored, kept the fire going, cooked, cleaned, read, and rested. But I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. Footprints in the dirt near the porch that I was sure hadn't been there before. Small broken branches along the trail I walked, and always the feeling that I was being watched. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, that animals were responsible. But the feeling grew stronger, insistent, gnawing at my sense of safety. One afternoon, I decided to hike further than usual. I followed the creek north, climbing over rocks and through thick underbrush. I noticed a faint trail, one that wasn't on my map. It was narrow, overgrown, and led deeper into the forest. My curiosity got the better of me. I rationalized that it was fine, that I could always turn back. The air grew cooler, the forest darker under the dense canopy. I kept an ear out for sounds, straining to distinguish birds or wind from something else. That's when I noticed the tracks. At first, I thought they were animal prints, maybe a deer, but the shape and size didn't match. They were larger, deeper, spaced in a way that suggested human weight. And they led in the same direction as the trail, straight into the forest. My heart started to pound. I debated whether to follow them or turn back. Something about the forest felt different, heavier, oppressive. But I was already too far to just walk back casually. I continued cautiously, keeping an eye on the prints. Hours passed. I saw no one, heard nothing unusual except the natural sounds of the forest. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Shadows moved oddly among the trees, and every rustle seemed too deliberate. By late afternoon, I realized I had wandered far from the cabin. The trail ended abruptly at a steep drop into a small ravine. There was no way to go forward safely, and the forest behind me looked the same in every direction. I felt the first real pang of fear. I didn't panic yet, but my mind raced with worst-case scenarios. I turned to retrace my steps. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The prints hadn't ended at the ravine. They had circled around, leading in a wide arc that, if they continued, could lead right back to the cabin. My heart sank. The thought of someone following me, someone possibly hiding nearby, made my skin crawl. I hurried back the way I had come, keeping low, moving quietly, listening intently. Every snap of a branch, every distant rustle sent adrenaline surging. By the time I reached the cabin, it was near sunset. I rushed inside, locked the door, and barricaded it with a chair. I checked the windows, saw nothing, heard nothing, but the footprints were clear now in my mind. Someone or something had followed me from the trail, and they could be anywhere. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that the forest was large, that I was probably imagining things, but deep down I knew it was unlikely. That night was the longest of my life. Every sound outside made me tense. The wind rattling the trees, branches scraping the walls, even small animals moving in the underbrush felt like threats. I kept the fire burning, pacing the cabin, checking the doors and windows repeatedly. I didn't sleep. I stayed alert, feeling trapped and isolated. The forest suddenly hostile instead of peaceful. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, grabbed my map and compass, and prepared to hike back to the nearest road. But as I stepped outside, I froze. Footprints surrounded the cabin, not just near the porch, but circling the entire structure. Large, deep human prints, and they were fresh, the soil still moist. My pulse surged. Whoever had followed me was close, possibly still watching. I made a snap decision. I didn't wait. I moved quickly, heading down the road that led away from the forest, taking a longer, less direct path to avoid any potential ambush. Every few minutes I stopped, listening, watching. The forest was silent, but my imagination filled it with movement. Hours passed. My legs ached. My throat was dry, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Finally, as evening approached, I reached the main road. I saw a car in the distance and ran toward it, waving my arms frantically. The driver slowed and pulled over. I explained briefly my situation, trying to keep my voice steady, and they offered to drive me to the nearest town. I accepted without hesitation. The sight of other people, of civilization, brought a wave of relief I hadn't expected. I never returned to that cabin. Weeks later, I contacted the local Forest Service and reported what had happened. They said they had no record of any recent disturbances in the area, no reports of suspicious activity, nothing. But the memory of those footprints, the feeling of being followed, and the terror of being completely alone in that forest stayed with me. I realized then how fragile the illusion of safety really was, how quickly peace could turn into fear when you're isolated in a place meant for solitude. In the months after, I started taking small steps to reclaim my sense of safety. I hiked in populated areas, always telling someone where I was going, keeping my phone and tools with me. The memory of the cabin faded slowly, but it never left entirely. And sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I hear a faint rustle in the corner of my mind, a whisper of that forest, and I remember how quickly calm can become fear when the world you trust is suddenly full of unknowns. The experience changed me. I no longer romanticize isolation. I learned that the world can feel peaceful and safe until it isn't, and that being prepared is not enough when the unknown is patient and silent. The forest is still beautiful, still majestic, but now it carries the weight of memory, a reminder that fear can hide behind even the most serene places, and that returning to safety is sometimes the only way to survive. Started as a trip I thought would be simple, a weekend getaway to a cabin deep in the forest. I had found it online, a small wooden structure that sat on the edge of a private lake, far from the road and even farther from anyone else. The pictures looked perfect. Rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, a porch with a view of the water. I imagined myself spending 2 days alone, reading, hiking, and just letting the quiet sink into my bones. I thought of it as a retreat, a chance to step away from the constant noise of the city, the traffic, the people, the constant pressure of life. But I did not realize that the isolation I sought would become the very thing that almost broke me. I drove all afternoon, the sun dropping low behind the trees as I wound along narrow, uneven forest roads. The cabin's GPS coordinates were precise, but the final stretch was barely more than a dirt path, flanked by dense undergrowth and old, towering pines. Each turn brought me deeper into silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy and watchful. My phone signal dropped to nothing about halfway there, but I didn't think much of it. I told myself this was the point of the trip, disconnection. By the time I arrived, the sky was a muted orange and purple, fading into a creeping darkness. The cabin looked just like the pictures, and for a few minutes I felt that surge of relief that I had made it to my own little sanctuary. I parked and unloaded my bag, noting the smell of wet pine and the earthy scent of the lake just beyond the small clearing. The air was sharp, colder than I expected for late summer, and it brushed against my skin in a way that made me aware of every nerve ending. The cabin was old but well kept. The porch creaked under my weight, and I noticed small details that I wouldn't have in the photos. Tiny cracks in the wood, a rust stain where the rain had run down the roof, the faint smell of mildew in one corner. Still nothing alarming. I set my things down, opened the windows to let in the air, and turned on the small gas stove to heat water for coffee. As I worked, I noticed the forest around me was growing darker, the trees thickening into a wall. The light from the cabin seemed almost alien in comparison, casting long shadows that twisted between the trunks. I decided to take a short walk before night fully fell, hoping to get a sense of the area. The ground was soft from recent rain, and every step made a faint squelching sound. The lake glimmered faintly under the last traces of sunlight, a dark silver mirror surrounded by trees. I felt completely alone, not just isolated, but like the forest had absorbed all other life and left me as its only occupant. There was a rustling behind me, a branch snapping, a small animal maybe, but when I turned, nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but the sound repeated, closer this time, and I realized I was gripping my flashlight tighter than I had intended. When I returned to the cabin, the sky was almost completely dark. The stars were bright and clear, the kind you don't usually see in the city. I made coffee and sat on the porch, trying to calm the tension I hadn't realized had built up during the walk. The forest felt alive in a different way at night. Shadows shifted unnaturally, sounds were magnified, and the wind carried noises that I couldn't immediately identify. I thought about going to bed early, but something made me hesitate. I felt watched, though there was no one there. I rationalized it. Perhaps my mind was just playing tricks in the dark. I tried to read, but I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting to see movement that never came. Around midnight, I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. A low, dragging sound coming from the side of the cabin. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the wind or an animal brushing against the trees. But the sound continued, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably close. It wasn't a small animal. It had weight, rhythm, and persistence. My first thought was a deer, then a bear, but the way the sound moved around the cabin didn't match either. Circled, paused, then moved again. I realized, with a jolt, that I hadn't seen any other humans on the path, and the forest was supposed to be empty. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The beam cut a sharp line through the darkness, illuminating the dense brush. Nothing. I circled the cabin slowly, trying to identify the source of the noise, each footstep loud in the still night. Then I saw it. A small section of disturbed dirt and broken branches on the far side of the cabin, near the back where the trees pressed in closer. It looked fresh. My stomach turned. Someone or something had been there and had been moving around my cabin. I went back inside and locked the doors, checking each window. My hands shook, and my heart pounded against my ribs. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept thinking I heard whispers or murmurs, but I knew there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. The next day, I tried to keep busy. I hiked along the marked trail near the lake, trying to convince myself the previous night was just stress and imagination. The forest seemed normal in daylight, birds calling, sunlight filtering through leaves, squirrels rustling. But I noticed subtle signs. Broken twigs along the trail that didn't match my footsteps, footprints near the cabin that were not mine, and the sense that the forest was watching me. I returned to the cabin, cleaned up, and kept checking my surroundings. By evening, I realized something critical. My phone was dead, and there was no signal to call for help. The isolation I had sought was now complete, and it carried a weight I had not anticipated. I started to notice more than the sounds. A tree branch tapping against the cabin window when the wind was calm. Small dents in the earth around the porch, almost like someone had knelt or crouched there. I felt trapped in the cabin, each corner seeming like a potential hiding place. The walls that had felt protective now felt confining. The second night was worse. The dragging sounds returned, louder and more deliberate. They circled the cabin, stopping briefly before moving again. I could hear footsteps, soft but heavy, sometimes in tandem, like someone was pacing. I didn't dare go outside. I barricaded the doors as best as I could and sat in the darkest corner of the cabin, trying to stay as small and quiet as possible. Hours passed, each one stretching like a year, until eventually the noise stopped. I don't know if whoever or whatever was outside had left or just paused. Morning brought no relief. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I was trapped. The path back to the road was overgrown, and my car would be spotted if I made a break for it. I considered walking into the forest to find another exit, but the thought of leaving the cabin completely exposed was terrifying. I started collecting rocks and sticks, readying myself to defend against whatever might return. I stayed alert the entire day, moving cautiously, checking every corner, listening for the slightest shift in the wind or brush. The dragging sounds never returned during daylight, but the feeling of being watched never left. At one point, I thought I saw a figure among the trees, but it vanished before I could focus. My mind teetered between rational explanations, hunters, hikers, stray animals, and the creeping realization that someone might be intentionally stalking the cabin, waiting for the right moment. By the third day, I was exhausted, I had slept only in short bursts, never fully letting myself relax. My coffee and food supplies were running low, and the constant tension was gnawing at my ability to think clearly. I considered leaving at night, but the thought of stepping into the black forest with whoever had been there lurking nearby was unbearable. Then I noticed something that changed everything. The cabin's back door had faint scratch marks along the edge, fresh and deep. Someone had tried to force their way in while I was inside. That realization hit me like a physical blow. I was no longer just alone. I was being hunted. I spent the rest of that day preparing. I barricaded doors with furniture, collected tools that could serve as weapons, and placed heavy objects near windows. I even created makeshift alarms by stringing cans along the perimeter of the porch, hoping to hear if someone tried to approach again. Every noise, every shadow, every gust of wind became a potential threat. The cabin that had felt safe and peaceful was now a prison, and I had no idea how long it would last. I had planned the trip for months, carefully organizing every detail. The cabin was in a remote area, far from any town or main road, nestled deep within the forest. I had chosen it because I needed complete isolation, a chance to disconnect from everything and everyone. Life had been hectic, and I thought the silence of the woods would be healing. The drive in itself was long and tiring. The last few miles were on a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Potholes, loose gravel, and overhanging branches slowed me down, and the sun was dipping low in the sky by the time I finally reached the cabin. The forest had a heavy, almost suffocating feel to it, the kind that makes every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig feel amplified, though I told myself it was only my imagination. The cabin was rustic, built from rough-hewn logs with a tin roof and a stone chimney. It was small, just one main room with a loft, but it was cozy. There were signs of previous visitors, though not recent. Old footprints in the dust on the wooden floor, a few empty cans and bottles tucked in a corner, and a pile of firewood stacked haphazardly. I spent the first hour unpacking my supplies, setting up a small kitchen area with the food and water I had brought, and inspecting the place thoroughly. Everything seemed solid enough, but I noticed the door locks were old and worn, the kind you could probably pry open with effort. I shrugged it off. This was the wilderness, and I told myself there was no one around for miles. That first night, the sounds of the forest were relentless. Crickets chirped constantly, an owl hooted periodically, and the wind made the trees creak and groan. At first, I enjoyed the isolation, feeling a strange thrill at being completely alone. But as darkness deepened, a creeping unease began to settle in. Every small noise startled me, and I found myself checking the windows and doors repeatedly. The cabin seemed to amplify every sound. The wind rattling the tin roof sounded like footsteps on the porch, and the branches scraping the walls sounded like scratching at the windows. I rationalized it over and over, telling myself I was fine, that it was only the forest being the forest. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a small stream nearby, and I spent a few hours walking along its banks, taking in the quiet beauty of the woods. I noticed signs that animals were abundant here. Deer tracks, broken branches where larger animals had moved through, and clusters of small animal holes near the trees. The sun was high, and the forest seemed peaceful in daylight. Returning to the cabin, I felt a little more at ease, though there was still that nagging tension in my chest. Something about the isolation made me hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. That night, the unease intensified. Around midnight, I heard a strange noise outside. It was soft at first, almost like a low scratching or scuffling. Then it grew louder and more deliberate. I froze, straining my ears, trying to identify it. It sounded like something was moving around the cabin, walking just outside. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a wild animal, maybe a raccoon or a fox. But as the minutes stretched on, the sounds became heavier, more coordinated, like something large was pacing back and forth. My heart began to race, and I realized I had not locked the doors properly. I ran to the main door and secured it as tightly as I could, moving the heavy furniture in front of it as an extra barrier. My pulse was hammering in my ears, and I could feel sweat on my back despite the cold night air. I sat in the corner of the cabin, listening. The noise outside continued intermittently, sometimes stopping for long stretches, only to start again with soft, heavy steps around the perimeter. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a bear or some other large creature. But deep down, a part of me knew this was different. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like someone or something was testing me. I thought about the old, worn locks on the doors and realized that if anyone had wanted to, they could easily force them open. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had a small hatchet by my side and a pocket knife in my pocket, enough for some rudimentary defense if necessary. By the third day, I became obsessed with every little sound. I barely slept, dozing in short bursts and waking at the slightest noise. During the day, I reinforced the doors and windows as best I could with nails, wood planks, and heavy furniture. I even stacked firewood against the back door, though I knew it was more symbolic than practical. The forest felt increasingly menacing, and I began to notice things I hadn't before. Footprints in the mud near the cabin that didn't match any of mine, some flattened areas in the grass near the perimeter, and broken branches that looked like they had been forced down intentionally. My mind raced constantly, imagining what or who might be out there. I knew logically that it could be a wild animal, maybe even a bear, but the movements felt too careful, too targeted. The fourth night was the worst. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something attempting to open the main door. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the doorknob rattled, and I could feel vibrations through the floorboards. I grabbed the hatchet and stood ready, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, rapid bursts. I could hear deliberate movements outside, scraping sounds, the sound of branches snapping under weight. Time stretched in unbearable slowness. I stayed completely silent, barely daring to breathe, every muscle tensed for action. The door shook violently for a few moments, then silence returned. I dared not move until I was certain the sounds had gone, listening for hours until the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows. At daylight, I inspected the exterior of the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt and mud, large ones, too big to be human if it were a normal adult male. The prints circled the cabin, then vanished into the forest. I tried to convince myself it was an animal again, but a persistent, gnawing fear settled in my stomach. I realized that staying in the cabin any longer could be dangerous. Even if it was an animal, it had learned that I was here, that I was isolated, and that gave it an advantage. I had to leave, but the idea of driving the long, narrow dirt road alone after such nights was terrifying in itself. Still, I knew it was safer than staying put. The decision was made. I would pack and leave that morning. I moved quickly, trying not to linger. I packed my essentials, stripped the cabin bare of anything that could draw attention, and secured what I could. I kept one hand on my hatchet at all times. As I finished, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A pile of sticks and debris arranged in a rough semicircle near the back of the cabin, almost like a crude warning or marker. It had not been there when I arrived. I didn't wait to investigate. I took my bag and moved to the vehicle, parked at the edge of the clearing. The drive back was tense. Every sound of the forest seemed magnified. Every movement along the roadside felt like someone was following. I forced myself to keep driving, eyes darting constantly to the edges of the road, heart hammering in my chest. Hours passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. Finally, I reached the main highway, and the sense of being watched gradually faded. I pulled into a small gas station, parked, and let out the breath I hadn't realized I had been holding. The lights, the signs, and the presence of other people were overwhelming, almost comforting. I felt almost guilty for feeling relief, but I could not help it. The experience left me shaken, and the cabin trip became a story I would replay in my mind countless times. Over the next few weeks, I contacted local authorities to report the incident, providing all the details I could. They took the report seriously but admitted that without physical evidence or direct witness testimony, there was little they could do. The cabin itself had been on private land, and its owner had not reported any recent trespassing incidents. Still, the fear, the precise movements of whatever had been near the cabin, and the footprints convinced me that I had narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous encounter. I learned to trust my instincts more than ever. Months later, I returned to the same area, this time with a small group and proper preparation, just to understand what had happened. The forest was quiet, untouched by any signs of danger, and the cabin was long gone, dismantled or reclaimed by nature. Walking the area carefully, I found remnants of tracks and flattened brush, enough to remind me of that first terrifying night. I realized then that the fear I had felt was entirely real and rational. The isolation, the sounds, the footprints, all had combined to create a situation that could have ended badly if I had been unprepared. I finally felt closure, understanding that the forest was neutral, that danger was real but manageable with caution and awareness. The experience stayed with me, but I no longer felt powerless. I had survived, learned, and grown stronger from it. Over time, I made sure every future trip to remote areas was carefully planned, equipped with safety measures, emergency contacts, and clear exit strategies. The forest never scared me in the same way again because I respected it properly, and I understood that fear was a guide, not a trap. I shared the story with a few close friends, never exaggerating or embellishing it, because it was terrifying enough in its truth. The cabin incident became a lesson about vigilance, preparedness, and the reality that isolation in the wilderness is as beautiful as it is unforgiving. I never returned to that exact spot, but I often thought of it, remembering how real fear feels when you are completely alone, and how relief tastes when you finally escape it safely, fully aware of every decision that led you there and every choice that saved you. I never thought I would find myself so far away from everything I knew, deep in the woods where the roads disappeared and the sky felt heavy and low. The cabin had seemed like a good idea at the time, a retreat from the constant noise of the city, from the emails and messages and the way life had begun to feel like a machine that refused to stop. I had scouted the place online weeks before, looking at the photographs that made it seem cozy, almost inviting. A small log cabin tucked among tall pine trees, a fire pit outside, a narrow dirt path leading to the nearest town more than 20 minutes away by car. The owner's description promised solitude, the kind that lets your thoughts breathe. I hadn't realized just how much solitude I would find. The drive had been long, the winding roads climbing through hills that grew steeper and steeper until the engine of my old hatchback struggled with the grade. I had passed no one for miles, only the occasional deer darting across the road in a blur. By the time I reached the final turn, a narrow track that disappeared into a tunnel of branches, it was already late afternoon. The sun was slanting, turning everything golden and sharp, throwing long shadows across the undergrowth. The cabin appeared just as the description had promised, a squat, dark structure of weathered logs, smoke curling lazily from a chimney, a small window reflecting the sun. It looked abandoned at first glance, but the neatness of the firewood stacked outside suggested someone cared for it, at least occasionally. I parked and took a moment to stretch, inhaling the air, crisp and cold, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. It was quiet in a way that made my chest ache. No birds sang, no wind rustled through the trees, nothing moved except the occasional leaf drifting lazily down. I felt a flicker of unease, the way a stillness so complete makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I told myself it was just the isolation, nothing more, and went to the door. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and damp, a faint mustiness that spoke of long months of being closed up. Dust motes floated in the narrow shafts of light through the window. The cabin was small but functional. A kitchenette in one corner, a wood-burning stove, a table with a few chairs, and a bed tucked against the far wall. Everything was sparse, but clean, and it was easy to imagine spending a weekend here, away from everything. I dropped my bag by the bed, letting my shoulders relax. The first night felt peaceful, almost serene. I lit the stove, stacked some wood in the firebox, and set about making a simple meal. The quiet was heavy but manageable. It seemed almost polite, as though the forest itself had agreed to let me be. I sat at the table, listening to the faint crackle of the fire, feeling a strange, almost foolish sense of contentment. Night came, as it always does, slowly swallowing the woods outside. The cabin's small window showed nothing but darkness, the trees forming black, irregular shapes against the dim sky. I went to bed early, knowing I had a long hike planned the next day, and the bed was firm and surprisingly comfortable. I slept in a half-conscious haze, my dreams a mix of wind rustling through branches and the imagined creak of floorboards. I woke once in the night to the sound of something outside, soft at first, almost imperceptible. At first, I thought it was an animal, perhaps a raccoon or a fox moving through the brush. But then I heard it again, deliberate and slow, the snap of a branch, the subtle crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. My stomach tightened. The forest was close, the way it pressed against the cabin walls, and I realized how vulnerable I was. I lay very still, straining to hear, and after a few minutes, the sounds faded. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, curled up tighter under the blanket, forcing sleep back over me. Morning brought sunlight through the small window, and the world outside looked innocent again, welcoming almost. I had breakfast and prepared for the hike I had planned. A long, looping trail through hills that rose sharply beyond the cabin, following a small river. The maps I had printed were crude, topographical diagrams showing contour lines and faint symbols for streams, bridges, and clearing spots. I strapped on my backpack, making sure the essentials were there. Water, snacks, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone, which had little signal but enough to ping occasionally. I left the cabin, locking the door behind me, and stepped into the forest. The air was cold, sharper than the previous day, and the trail rose almost immediately. My legs protested, muscles stiff from the drive and the long hours spent sitting, but I kept moving, telling myself the effort was part of the reward. I never thought I would find myself so far away from everything I knew, deep in the woods where the roads disappeared and the sky felt heavy and low. The cabin had seemed like a good idea at the time, a retreat from the constant noise of the city, from the emails and messages and the way life had begun to feel like a machine that refused to stop. I had scouted the place online weeks before, looking at the photographs that made it seem cozy, almost inviting. A small log cabin tucked among tall pine trees, a fire pit outside, a narrow dirt path leading to the nearest town more than 20 minutes away by car. The owner's description promised solitude, the kind that lets your thoughts breathe. I hadn't realized just how much solitude I would find. The drive had been long. The first part of the hike was straightforward. The trail was marked, though the paint on the trees was faded, and the path occasionally disappeared under fallen branches or wet moss. I crossed a small creek, the water clear and cold, stepping on stones that were slippery underfoot. Birds began to sing, distant woodpeckers drumming on unseen trunks, and I allowed myself to relax, breathing deeply. But as the day wore on, I noticed the trail became less distinct. Branches crisscrossed the path, fallen trees blocked the way, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. It was easy to misstep here, and I made a mental note to pay attention. The forest, beautiful and calm in the morning, began to feel heavier as I went deeper. Sunlight filtered weakly through the tall canopy, casting narrow streaks on the ground. Every sound became pronounced, the rustle of leaves underfoot, the distant call of a hawk, the soft hum of insects. And I began to realize I had not seen another person in hours. By mid-afternoon, I reached a point where the trail was almost entirely indistinct. I stopped to check my map and GPS and discovered something troubling. The device showed me off the main trail. I had taken a smaller branch that veered left, thinking it was a shortcut to a clearing I wanted to see, but it had led me into denser forest. I tried to backtrack, but the ground had changed subtly. Moss covered the fallen trees and rocks, and the trail I thought I had followed disappeared entirely. My heart began to beat faster. I was not far from the cabin in terms of distance, perhaps a mile or two, but the terrain was rough, and I realized how quickly I could lose my bearings. I forced myself to slow down, marking small cairns of rocks along the way to help me retrace my steps, moving carefully over roots and uneven earth. As evening approached, I noticed another problem. The sky had clouded over. The sunlight dimmed rapidly, filtered through thick gray clouds. The forest grew darker, the trees casting long, black shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. My pace quickened, not out of fear exactly, but out of the urgent knowledge that night would make the woods treacherous. The uneven ground, hidden roots, and low branches that had been manageable in daylight would become hazards in the dark. I had packed a flashlight, but I knew it could not illuminate the dense forest for long. I needed to reach the cabin before darkness settled fully. Panic began to edge in as I stumbled over a mossy log, twisting my ankle slightly. Pain shot up my leg, and I had to sit for a moment, pressing my hand against the swollen joint. My mind ran through options. I could continue on, risking further injury, or I could stop and wait, but I had no idea how far I was from the cabin, and nightfall was coming fast. I decided to push on, moving slowly, carefully testing each step, using my walking stick for balance. The forest seemed endless, the path unclear, every bend in the terrain making me doubt my sense of direction. My lungs burned, my legs ached, and I began to feel the creeping awareness of real isolation. The knowledge that if I fell or got injured further, there would be no one to help me. The forest, which had felt polite and almost comforting the day before, now felt oppressive, indifferent, and heavy. Night fell in full force before I recognized it. The flashlight provided a narrow cone of light that barely reached a few feet ahead. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, made my head whip around, trying to locate the source. My stomach knotted, and I realized how foolish I had been to come here alone, unprepared for nightfall in a dense forest. The cold began to seep into my bones, and I remembered the small emergency blanket I had packed. I tore it from my backpack and wrapped it around my shoulders, feeling slightly warmer, but more aware of my vulnerability. The ankle hurt more now, and every step sent sharp pains up my leg. I had to stop frequently, breathing heavily, trying to calm my mind while navigating in almost complete darkness. Then I heard something, a noise different from the usual forest sounds. A low, deliberate cracking, like footsteps, moving slowly and unevenly. My heart leapt, my pulse pounding in my ears. I froze, listening, stopped, then started again, distant but moving closer. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps another hiker, perhaps an animal. But the steps were too heavy for a small animal and too irregular for someone walking normally. I gripped the flashlight tightly, scanning the trees around me. Shadows seemed to shift and writhe in the beam. Every instinct told me to move, to get to safety, but the path was unclear. I began to run cautiously, hopping over roots, sidestepping fallen branches, the beam of light bouncing wildly. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes, perhaps hours. My body ached, my ankle swollen, my energy nearly spent. The forest seemed endless, dark, suffocating. Then, faintly at first, I saw a shaft of light breaking through the trees. My chest leapt. Daylight? A clearing? No, it was the cabin. Its small window glowed warmly from the light of the stove I had lit that morning, a beacon of safety. Relief washed over me in waves, almost making me stumble. I reached the cabin, fumbled with the key, and pushed the door open, collapsing inside. I sank to the floor, trembling, my body exhausted, my ankle throbbing, sweat and dirt covering my clothes. I checked the stove, still warm, the fire embers glowing. I dragged a chair over, sat down, and leaned my head against the wall, finally allowing myself to breathe. The forest outside was silent now, the sounds of night muted through the thick logs. I felt the enormity of what had just happened, the isolation, the disorientation, the near panic that had gripped me when I thought I was being followed. And I realized how unprepared I had been, how easily a day's hike could have turned fatal in a place so remote. I spent the night in the cabin, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the occasional groan of the wooden structure and the faint rustle of trees outside. Sleep came slowly, fragmented, but when morning arrived, I felt a small measure of control return. I prepared a hot meal, ate slowly, drank water, and examined my ankle. The swelling had reduced slightly, and I realized I could make the drive back if I was careful. I packed my bag, checked the cabin one last time, and stepped outside. The forest in daylight was calm, the sun filtering through the trees, birds singing. It seemed almost serene, almost forgiving. I took a deep breath, retracing the path to the road with caution, moving slowly, marking my way as I went. By the time I reached my car, exhausted and dirty, I realized how much I had underestimated the forest, the cabin, and the isolation. I drove back slowly, my mind racing with what had happened, what could have gone wrong, and how fragile safety could be. The city lights felt like a blessing when they finally appeared, the roads familiar, the traffic a reassurance. But I carried the experience with me, a lesson learned in full clarity. Isolation can be peaceful, but it can also be dangerous, and the woods do not forgive mistakes. I never returned to that cabin. I never even tried. The memory remained, vivid and sharp, a story of how close I had come to being trapped, and how I had survived through caution, endurance, and a stubborn refusal to give in to fear. The fear I felt was not of ghosts or of anything imagined. It was fear of reality. The dark forest, the uncertainty, the vulnerability of a human alone in a place that demanded respect. I had survived, and that survival felt like a gift, a clear reminder that life is fragile, and that sometimes the most terrifying experiences are the ones that are real. This is a full, continuous narrative with realistic suspense, extreme attention to detail, and a clear, good ending. If you want, I can expand this further to reach over 7,000 words, adding even more ultra-detailed hiking sequences, the cabin's layout, survival challenges, the thought process during isolation, and detailed reflections to make it extremely long and immersive. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The cabin I rented was deep in the mountains, far from roads, neighbors, and cell service. It was advertised as isolated, peaceful, and perfect for someone who wanted to be completely alone. I needed this. Work had been crushing me. My apartment in the city felt suffocating, and the constant noise made my mind race all the time. I wanted to escape. I wanted to disconnect, to be entirely alone with my thoughts. But what I didn't expect was how deeply alone it could feel, and how quickly peace could turn into fear. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. The sun was just dipping behind the jagged mountain peaks, throwing long shadows over the dense pine forest. The path leading to the cabin was overgrown, rough and narrow, the kind of track that made me wonder if any car had passed through it in years. My small SUV struggled over roots and rocks, grinding and rattling, until finally, the cabin appeared ahead, tucked into a hollow and almost hidden by the trees. It was small, rustic, and made entirely of dark wood. The smell of damp earth and pine hit me immediately as I stepped out. The door creaked as I unlocked it and pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic like iron. The cabin was simple. A small living space with a wood stove, a kitchen counter with basic utensils, a single bedroom with a thin mattress, and a loft above that I assumed could hold extra sleeping bags or guests if necessary. There was no electricity, no running water except a hand pump outside, and no phone signal. Exactly what I wanted, I reminded myself. I spent the first hour exploring the small area around the cabin. The forest pressed in on all sides, thick with undergrowth and tall pines. There was a small stream a few hundred feet away, its water clear and cold, the sound of it trickling over stones almost hypnotic. I collected some firewood, stacked it neatly near the stove, and checked the cabin thoroughly to make sure all windows and doors locked properly. It felt cozy if slightly too enclosed. I lit a small fire, feeling the warmth of it spread through the room as shadows from the flames danced across the walls. There was a silence so complete that it almost pressed against my ears. No birds, no wind, not even the faint rustle of a squirrel. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, and I felt suddenly aware of how far I was from anything familiar. Night fell quickly. The mountains blocked the last rays of sunlight, and the forest became pitch dark almost instantly. I had brought a small lantern, but the shadows it cast seemed to stretch endlessly, making the corners of the cabin feel deeper than they were. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, washed down with water from the stream, and tried to settle in for the night. I kept the fire low, not wanting to attract insects or animals. At first, everything was fine. I listened to the faint sounds of the stream and the occasional snap of a branch from the forest. But as the darkness deepened, I realized how many sounds I had been ignoring during the day. Every small rustle of leaves, every tiny cracking of wood, seemed magnified in the silence. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint, deliberate snap from outside the cabin. I froze. My heart started pounding immediately. The first sound could have been anything, a falling branch, an animal, but then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps. They weren't running or hurried, just slow, measured. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but my rational mind fought with the creeping dread in my chest. I moved closer to the window and peered through the darkness. The trees were black silhouettes against the night sky. Nothing moved. I strained my ears. Another snap, then silence. I backed away from the window, telling myself I was being paranoid, that isolation can make even the calmest person jumpy. I tried to go back to sleep, but my body refused. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the wood, made me tense up. The air felt colder than it had been earlier, and I found myself pulling the thin blanket around me like it could somehow protect me from whatever was out there. Hours passed. I listened, every minute feeling stretched out, elongated by fear. Occasionally, I heard it again, the deliberate step on a branch outside. Always far enough away that I couldn't see anything, but close enough to know that someone, or something, was moving through the forest. I tried reasoning with myself, thinking maybe someone had rented the cabin next door or was camping nearby, but I knew the place was advertised as remote. The closest road was at least 2 miles away, and any other cabin was miles beyond that. It didn't make sense. Whoever it was, they had no reason to be there. My mind raced with possibilities. An escaped criminal? A lost hiker? A trespasser? Every theory made me more anxious. By dawn, I had barely slept. I watched the first light filter through the trees, painting the forest in muted greens and browns. I decided I needed to check outside, to see if there were any signs of footprints or disturbances around the cabin. I dressed quickly, grabbing a flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold morning air hit me hard, making me shiver. The forest was quiet now, almost peaceful again. I walked slowly around the cabin, looking for signs. That's when I saw it. Footprints in the soft earth, large boots, circling the cabin. They were fresh. My stomach dropped. Someone had been outside while I tried to sleep, circling my cabin in the darkness. There was no pattern, just a slow, cautious walk. Whoever it was, they had been watching me, waiting, or maybe deciding what to do next. I realized how vulnerable I had been, completely exposed in the middle of nowhere with no help. I didn't stay outside long. I went back into the cabin, locked the door, and considered my options. The forest around me was vast, and the nearest road was 2 miles through rough terrain. My SUV was parked at the start of the path, but if anyone was waiting, they could intercept me easily. I didn't have a gun, and I didn't want to confront anyone physically. I decided to wait until full daylight, hoping the light would give me some safety. I spent the morning quietly, moving only when necessary, keeping the fire going and scanning the windows constantly. The footsteps hadn't returned, but I knew it was just a matter of time. By late morning, I felt a little braver. I decided I needed to leave. I packed everything into my car, making sure nothing was left behind that could be stolen or used against me. I left the cabin door locked and carefully retraced the path through the forest, my eyes constantly scanning for movement. Every shadow felt like a potential threat. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that the forest was just full of sounds and shapes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, following me, or at least aware of my presence. The path was rough, and I stumbled more than once, my heart racing with every snapping branch underfoot. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors immediately, climbed inside, and started the engine. I didn't look back. The drive down the mountain was tense. Every noise from the forest, Every flicker of movement at the edge of the road made me glance at the mirrors. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel eyes on me. The SUV rattled over rocks and roots, but I kept going. After what felt like hours, I reached the main road. I stopped at a small gas station, and only then did I allow myself to relax slightly. I told the attendant I had been camping in the mountains and needed directions to the nearest town. His casual questions about my trip made me realize how much I had been holding myself tight in fear. I drove straight to a nearby motel and booked a room for the night, just to be certain I was safe. I never went back to that cabin. I reported the footprints and possible trespasser to the local ranger station, and they told me that sometimes hikers or hunters come too close to isolated cabins. They said it wasn't unusual, but that it was still risky. I understood that now. Isolation can be dangerous, not because of anything supernatural, but because humans are unpredictable and nature itself can hide threats. Looking back, I realized how naive I had been to think I could simply retreat into the wilderness and be safe. Peace comes with vigilance, and solitude can be a double-edged sword. The mountains are beautiful, but they are also indifferent, and I learned firsthand how quickly comfort can turn into fear when someone or something is watching. That experience changed the way I thought about being alone in remote areas. I still love the forest, the mountains, and the quiet, but I now approach them with respect and preparation. I know now that danger doesn't need to be mythical or supernatural. It can be human, real, and close. And that knowledge, while unsettling, makes every safe return home feel more precious, more earned, and more alive. I crept to the edge of the loft, looking over the railing. The living room was dark, only the remnants of the fire glowing faintly in the fireplace. The footsteps had stopped. I held my breath, listening. The wind outside howled through the trees, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then I saw it, a shadow moving across the floor, just outside the firelight. My heart froze. It was fast, fluid, almost predatory. I realized immediately that it wasn't an animal. The shape was too large, too human. Panic gripped me. I scrambled down the stairs, searching for something, anything, to defend myself. My hands found a heavy cast iron pan in the kitchen. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white, and moved cautiously toward the living room. The shadow had vanished. I looked around, the room empty, the windows dark. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I backed toward the door, thinking I might make a run for the car. As I reached for the doorknob, I heard it again. Soft, deliberate, coming from the kitchen. I swung around, pan raised. Nothing. My mind raced with possibilities. A burglar, someone hiding in the woods, someone who had been following me. I knew I had to get out. I ran to the front door, flung it open, and stepped outside into the cold night air. The forest was silent. The gravel driveway stretched ahead, dark and empty. My car was there, just as I had left it. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. That's when I saw it. A figure, crouched at the edge of the tree line, watching me. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The figure didn't move, just stared. I could make out a silhouette, tall, thin, wearing dark clothing. I slammed the car door, locked it, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness, and for a moment, I saw the figure step back into the trees. I drove, not looking back, my eyes fixed on the winding road. The trees passed like a blur, shadows stretching across the hood of the car. Every bump in the road made me flinch. Every distant sound in the forest sent my pulse skyrocketing. I didn't stop until I reached the first town, a small cluster of houses and lights that felt almost alien in its normalcy. I parked in front of a gas station, trying to calm my breathing, listening for the sounds of the forest that no longer followed me. The next morning, I returned to the cabin with the local police. They found signs that someone had been living in the woods near the cabin. Makeshift shelters, remnants of a campfire, and footprints leading toward the property. It appeared the person had been watching me, studying my movements, waiting. The officers assured me the person was likely a transient who moved between the forests. but the feeling of vulnerability lingered. Weeks later, I sold the cabin rental. I couldn't shake the memory of the shadowy figure, the deliberate footsteps, the feeling of being hunted in a place that was supposed to be safe. I learned to appreciate isolation from a distance, but I never sought it in that raw, uncontrolled way again. The experience taught me the forest is alive in ways we often don't understand, not with spirits or monsters, but with real people, real dangers, and the unpredictable rhythms of nature. I still remember that night clearly. The oppressive silence, the heavy darkness, the figure waiting in the shadows, changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, more grateful for the small comforts of safety. It was a lesson learned not from stories or myths, but from a terrifying brush with reality. In the quiet, untouched woods where no one could hear you scream, and where the line between peace and danger was thinner than I ever imagined. I remember the first time I decided to go completely alone into the mountains. I had been working nonstop for months in the city, dealing with long hours, loud noises, and a small apartment that felt like a cage. The idea of disappearing into silence, even for a few days, was too tempting to pass up. I found a cabin online, remote enough to feel isolated but still reachable by a rough dirt road. The photos made it look welcoming, rustic, and solid enough that it felt safe, even if it was deep in the wilderness. I had the money to rent it for a week, and I told myself this would be a reset. A chance to breathe, to escape from people, from traffic, from everything. I packed my car carefully, more than I needed, because I couldn't imagine what I might need in such isolation. Food, water, firewood, blankets, a first aid kit, some extra clothing, a few books, and my camera. I thought of nothing else. The drive was long, longer than I expected. The city fell behind. The highways gave way to twisting mountain roads lined with thick pine trees, and the air began to smell of damp soil and leaves. By the time I reached the small gravel road leading to the cabin, the sun was low, casting an orange glow across the forest. The trees towered overhead, dense and unmoving, and the air was silent except for the occasional bird. I parked my car at the start of the driveway and looked at the cabin in the fading light. It was smaller than I imagined, a simple wooden structure with a small porch and smoke stains near the chimney. The windows were dusty but intact, and the door seemed sturdy. I felt a thrill. This was exactly what I wanted, being completely alone, and the cabin looked strong enough to withstand anything nature could throw at me. I unpacked slowly, putting things in their places. The cabin smelled faintly of mildew and wood, a smell I immediately associated with old places that had been neglected. I didn't mind. It felt authentic. The firewood was stacked neatly near the fireplace, the stove looked functional, and the sink had a small amount of running water. I set up my small space, placing my sleeping bag on the floor near the wood stove and arranging my supplies on the kitchen counter. By the time I finished, it was dark outside, the forest a wall of black around me. I lit the stove and then a small lantern, the flickering light pushing back shadows in the corners. The silence was thick, not the soft quiet of a library, but a deep, heavy quiet that made every creak of the cabin noticeable. Every groan of the wood seemed louder than it should be, and I realized quickly that I was not used to hearing only myself. I ate a simple dinner, bread, canned beans, and water, and then decided to go for a short walk around the property before it got too dark. The moon was rising, small and pale behind thin clouds, casting faint light over the uneven ground. I walked slowly, trying to take in everything. The trees were thick, the forest floor covered in pine needles, rocks, and roots that caught at my boots. At first, I felt calm, almost peaceful, listening to the wind rustle through the branches. Then I noticed the deer tracks, fresh in the soft earth, leading off toward the deeper woods. A shiver ran down my spine, not from fear, but from the realization that the forest was alive, and I was alone in it. The night was colder than I expected. Back in the cabin, I lit the stove fully, enjoying the crackle of fire and the warmth that slowly spread across the room. I unpacked a few books and sat near the stove, reading by the light of the lantern. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through gaps in the cabin's walls, rattling the windows. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the pages, but the sound of something moving outside caught my attention. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A snapping of a branch, deliberate and soft, too consistent to be random. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a fox, but my heart beat faster than usual. I kept checking the windows. My imagination made shadows dance on the trees, and I started noticing shapes that weren't there. I slept poorly that night, waking up every hour at the smallest noise, imagining someone, or something, was moving through the forest just beyond my vision. Morning came slowly, gray and overcast, and I felt drained. I packed a small backpack and decided to explore the trails near the cabin, hoping the daylight would ease my nerves. The trails were steep and uneven. Rocks, roots, and mud made each step precarious. I kept my eyes on the ground and the surrounding forest, constantly scanning for movement. Birds called occasionally, and I saw squirrels darting through the branches, but nothing else. I tried to enjoy it, to notice the small things. The smell of pine, the occasional patch of moss, the way the fog hung low in the hollows. I kept a small pocket knife in my hand, just in case, and kept telling myself that everything was fine, that I was imagining things. By the third day, the isolation was beginning to weigh on me. I could feel my mind stretching thin. I hadn't seen another person in more than 2 days. My phone barely had signal, and I had no way to call out except for a short window near the top of the hill. I was careful with supplies now, rationing food and water. Sleep was still difficult. Every night, the noises outside, the branches, the wind, small animals, kept me alert. I started hearing things that weren't there. At least I couldn't see them. Scratches, thumps, whispers of movement too faint to identify. I reminded myself that in the forest, small animals caused most noises, but still I felt watched. On the fourth day, I decided to chop firewood outside, wanting to clear my mind and get some physical activity. The axe felt heavy, but the work was satisfying. I noticed tracks around the cabin, too big for a dog, maybe a wild animal. Bear, perhaps? I stayed close to the cabin, axe in hand, listening for signs of life. The forest seemed quieter than usual. That evening, I cooked a small meal and kept the stove going long after eating. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the smallest noise. Then, on the fifth day, something happened that changed everything. I was outside, checking the perimeter, when I saw movement, 2 figures moving in the woods about 50 yards away. At first, I thought they were deer, but the shape was wrong, and the way they moved, slow, deliberate, crouched, made my stomach twist. They didn't make a sound, and I froze, heart racing. They disappeared behind a line of trees, and I rushed back to the cabin, locking the door and barricading it with a chair. I tried to calm myself, telling myself they were probably hunters or hikers, but something about the way they moved didn't seem human, or at least not casual human. My nerves were raw, and I didn't leave the cabin again that day. Night came, darker and colder than before. I layered blankets on the floor and sat near the stove, keeping my knife close. Every noise outside made me jump. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and I thought I heard whispers, barely audible, like someone breathing or talking softly. I tried to focus on anything else. The fire, my breathing, the small comfort of the cabin, but every sound made me tense. I felt trapped, surrounded by forest, by silence, and by the knowledge that someone or something was outside. Sleep came eventually, fitful and shallow. I dreamed of being followed, of someone crouching just beyond the trees, watching me. I woke multiple times, drenched in sweat, listening. At dawn, the wind had stopped and the forest seemed normal again, but the tracks remained. Footprints around the cabin that weren't mine, too large and irregular to be a deer or small animal. I didn't know what to do. I considered leaving immediately, but the road was steep and dangerous, and I had been warned about heavy fog at that time of year. I decided to wait, planning to leave as soon as visibility improved. On the 6th day, I prepared everything to leave. I packed up my food, blankets, and other supplies, but I had to check the road first. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the tree line. The tracks were gone. The forest seemed empty. Relief washed over me. I walked quickly to the car, keeping my eyes on the woods, expecting movement, expecting something to appear at any moment. I reached the car and started the engine. The gravel driveway crunched beneath the tires as I drove down the narrow path, checking the tree line constantly. As I rounded the final bend before the highway, I realized something. The fear that had consumed me wasn't about the forest itself, not really, but about the unpredictability of being alone and exposed. I had survived, and in doing so, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and accomplishment. I never saw the figures again, and the tracks never returned. I made it back to town, safe and intact, but forever aware that isolation can magnify every sound, every shadow, and every sense of vulnerability. In the weeks afterward, I thought about going back. Not to the same cabin, not yet. But I learned something about myself in that week. The strength it takes to face your fear alone, and the attention you must pay to the smallest details when survival is in your hands. I made plans for shorter trips, always prepared, always aware, but never again seeking the kind of isolation that had pushed me to my limits in that cabin. That week taught me caution, respect, and the quiet terror of solitude in a place where the forest is alive, and you are not the most alert being. By the end, I returned to the city with a new perspective. I appreciated company more, noise more, and the safety of routine. The memory of that cabin never faded. I knew what it meant to be truly alone and to feel vulnerable in a world where danger doesn't always announce itself. And though I survived without harm, I could never forget the feeling of being watched, the tension of waiting for something to appear, and the relief of finally escaping. It was a clear, vivid lesson in human fragility, and I carry it with me to this day. I had been planning the trip for months. It was supposed to be a weekend of quiet, a break from the noise of the city, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts. The cabin I rented was deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that I would have no distractions. When I first arrived, I felt the thrill of isolation, the kind that makes your chest tighten with anticipation. The drive there had been long and winding, the road narrowing as the trees on either side pressed closer together. By the time I reached the gravel driveway, the sun was already dipping behind the thick canopy of pine and oak, leaving long shadows stretching across the forest floor. The cabin was small, made of dark timber with a steep roof, and it smelled faintly of wood smoke and mildew. It wasn't modern, but that wasn't why I had chosen it. I wanted something real, something untouched by tourists or convenience. I parked my car and unloaded my bag. The sound of gravel crunching under my boots echoed in the still air, louder than I expected. The woods were silent, except for the distant call of a crow and the occasional rustle of leaves. I remember pausing at the edge of the driveway, looking around, feeling the air press against my skin in a way that made my heart rate pick up. The trees were tall and thick, their trunks dark, and the forest floor was littered with dead leaves and twigs. There was a feeling in the air, almost electric, like the woods themselves were watching me, waiting. The cabin door creaked as I opened it. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old smoke. Dust coated the floor, and cobwebs hung in the corners, catching the fading light that filtered through the grimy windows. There was a small kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft above. I dropped my bag and ran my hands over the rough wooden table, feeling the grooves and scratches etched into it over years. It was real, alive in a way modern constructions were not. I unpacked my few belongings and decided to explore the surrounding area before it got dark. The cabin was on a small clearing, with the forest pressing in on all sides. A narrow path led away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees. I walked for a while, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, leaves crunching underfoot. Birds were starting to settle in for the evening, and the forest became quiet in a way that felt heavy, like the air itself was listening. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, deer, I thought, or maybe a wild boar, but nothing that seemed immediately dangerous. Still, I felt a prickle of unease run down my spine. There was something about the way the forest held itself, dense and unbroken, that made it feel like I was intruding. By the time I returned, the sun had fully disappeared, and darkness was settling over the forest. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackling of the logs filling the small cabin with warmth and a faint, comforting glow. I sat on the edge of the sofa, looking into the flames, feeling both comforted and exposed at the same time. The walls were thin, and I could hear every small noise. The wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the creak of the floorboards. I reminded myself it was normal, that the woods were alive, and that nothing there wanted to hurt me. Still, the feeling of being watched did not go away. Night fell fully, and with it, a kind of oppressive silence that pressed in on the cabin. I tried to distract myself by checking my phone, but there was no signal. The battery was low, too, which left me with the realization that I was completely cut off. There was no way to call for help if something went wrong. I stared at the fire, feeling a strange mix of pride and fear. This was exactly what I had wanted, a complete escape. But the quiet had become heavy, almost suffocating. Every creak of the cabin sounded louder than it should, every rustle outside sharper. I kept thinking I saw shadows move just beyond the window, though I knew it was likely just branches swaying. I eventually climbed to the loft to sleep. The mattress was thin, the sheets rough, but it was enough. I pulled the covers over me, trying to calm my racing mind. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the roof and shaking the trees. I listened, telling myself it was natural. Still, every gust made me jump. Hours passed, and I eventually dozed, though not deeply. The dreamless sleep was fitful, punctuated by the occasional sound of branches scraping against the cabin. I woke to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps, not outside, but inside the cabin. My heart leapt into my throat. I sat up, straining to listen, my pulse pounding in my ears. The steps were slow, methodical, moving across the floor below. My mind raced. The cabin was supposed to be empty. I hadn't heard any other cars on the drive, no signs of anyone nearby. I felt a cold sweat run down my back. That night was worse than the first. I had slept lightly, keeping my ears tuned to every sound. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the snapping of branches. I could tell this time it wasn't far from the cabin. The sound of someone moving carefully, trying not to make too much noise, but still close enough that I felt trapped. My heart pounded. I grabbed a flashlight and the old hunting knife I had found in a drawer. I stayed in the living room, shining the light toward the windows. Shadows flitted between the trees. I wanted to open the door, to confront whoever was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Hours passed. The movement stopped. The forest grew silent again. I forced myself to sleep in fits, waking every hour. In the morning, I examined the surroundings carefully. There were more footprints, fresh this time, circling the cabin. Something had been out there all night. I felt a cold knot of panic, but I also realized I had to make a plan. Staying in the cabin without knowing who or what was outside was no longer safe. I packed my essentials: water, food, my keys, and some clothes. I didn't bring everything, just enough to get out. I planned to hike back to the road, where I could find a car or a way to call for help. The problem was that the forest around the cabin was dense, and I didn't know the trail well. I traced my steps from earlier, remembering landmarks like a fallen tree, a boulder, the bend of the river. I kept looking over my shoulder, listening for movement. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made my stomach drop. By late morning, I started moving. I stuck close to the river, keeping it to my left as I followed the trail back. The forest seemed alive with hidden threats. Small branches scraped my clothes, the ground was uneven, and every step required careful attention. I didn't hear anyone at first, but eventually, I started noticing signs. A small branch broken at waist height, footprints in soft soil, and shadows that seemed to move just beyond my sight. Whoever had been near the cabin was following me. I tried to speed up, but the uneven terrain made running impossible. For hours, I walked in tense silence, trying to stay calm. My mind ran through every possible scenario. If I encountered the person, what would I do? Could I fight them? Could I hide? Could I outrun them? Each option seemed worse than the last. The forest grew darker as the sun dipped behind the trees. I knew I couldn't stop, couldn't rest. My legs burned, my feet ached, but I kept moving, clinging to the thought that the road was just ahead. Finally, as dusk approached, I saw a clearing. My heart leapt. There was the road, a narrow strip of gravel cutting through the trees. I ran toward it, not caring about the uneven ground or the pain in my legs. I reached the road, and just beyond it, I saw headlights. Relief washed over me. I stepped onto the gravel and waved frantically. The car slowed and stopped. I explained, without speaking, my terrified gestures telling the story. Someone had been following me. The cabin was unsafe. I needed to get out. The driver nodded and let me in. The car roared to life, and we drove toward the nearest town. My hands shook so violently that I could barely grip the seat. The driver didn't ask questions, just kept a steady pace on the winding roads. When we reached a gas station, I called the police and reported the incident. They said they would send someone to check the cabin. I gave them all the details I could remember: the footprints, the sounds, the times. They assured me someone would investigate. In the days that followed, I learned that the cabin had been broken into before, and the owner had failed to mention it in the listing. Whoever had been following me likely knew the cabin was isolated, and they had been watching for someone to come. The thought made me shiver, but I was safe. I stayed in town for a few more days, catching my breath, staying in hotels, making sure I didn't leave the city limits until I felt steady again. The experience stayed with me, lingering in the corners of my mind. I realized that nature, while beautiful and serene, could also be dangerous in unexpected ways. Isolation made people vulnerable, and assumptions about safety could be deadly. I never returned to the cabin, and I never planned to. I learned the hard way that preparation and caution aren't just practical, they're essential. The cabin, the forest, and the quiet nights had promised peace, but they delivered fear. And while the fear was intense, it also forced me to be alert, to think, to survive. I survived because I paid attention, because I moved deliberately, because I refused to let panic take control. And in the end, the fear became a story, a lesson, and a reminder of how fragile safety can be when the world feels empty and quiet around you. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months, mostly to escape the noise of the city, the constant pressure of work, and the endless obligations that seemed to pile up no matter how hard I tried to keep up. The cabin was deep in the mountains, far enough from any major town that cell service was unreliable, and the nearest road ended several miles away at a small, gravel parking lot. From there, it was a half-mile hike along a barely marked trail that wound between thick pines and rocky ridges. I wanted isolation, and I would get it. The day I arrived, the sky was gray with thick clouds that hung low over the peaks. Rain had started to fall lightly on my drive up the mountain, and the smell of wet earth and pine was strong even through my car's closed windows. I parked at the trailhead, loaded my backpack with food, water, and firewood, and set off. The trail was slippery from the rain, with mud clinging to my boots and puddles forming in the low spots. The woods were quiet, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for any sound. Wind in the trees, the snap of a branch underfoot, distant water running through a creek. There were no birds singing. Even the usual insects seemed subdued. By the time I reached the cabin, the rain had grown heavier, hammering down on the tin roof and soaking through my jacket. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built of dark wood with a stone chimney and a front porch that sagged slightly under the weight of accumulated snow in the winter months. I dropped my pack, kicked off my mud-caked boots, and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and wood polish, faintly of mildew from the damp weather outside. I turned on the battery-powered lantern I had brought and began unpacking, stacking firewood near the stone fireplace and organizing my supplies. The first night was quiet but unsettling. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the window panes and whistling through the gaps in the wooden walls. I lit the fire and sat close, feeling the heat against the chill that had seeped into my bones. Shadows flickered across the room, cast by the firelight on the walls and ceiling, and every creak of the cabin made me jump slightly. There were noises outside too. Branches scraping together, the occasional thud of something heavy hitting the forest floor, and a persistent, distant rustling that I could not place. It was probably just wildlife, deer, raccoons, maybe a bear, but the sound had a rhythm almost deliberate that set my nerves on edge. I went to bed early, hoping to sleep through the storm. I woke several times that night to the sound of heavy rain, each time imagining that someone, or something, was moving just outside. Every time I opened my eyes, the cabin was empty and still, the only light coming from the weak glow of the lantern. I told myself it was ridiculous, that I was alone, and that nothing could get to me. Yet my heart pounded, and sleep came reluctantly. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the air fresh but damp, with clouds still heavy in the sky. I went outside to explore a little, following the faint trail past the cabin. The forest was dense, with moss-covered trees and fallen logs, slippery stones, and small rivulets of water running downhill. I saw signs of wildlife, tracks in the mud, broken branches, but no living animals. The sense of isolation was absolute. Even though the cabin was visible from where I walked, it felt like I had entered a different world, one without human presence. That night, I went to bed earlier, but sleep again eluded me. Around midnight, I heard the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Heavy, deliberate steps, crunching on the wet leaves and gravel. My heart stopped. I stayed frozen, listening, straining to hear if the sound was moving away or toward the cabin. The steps stopped suddenly, as if whoever or whatever was outside had realized I was awake. Then came a silence so complete it pressed against my ears, and I couldn't breathe properly. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, that the storm had loosened branches that were now settling, but the sound had been unmistakable. Deliberate, measured, not random at all. The following morning, I decided I had to investigate. I left the cabin cautiously, carrying a longer stick for protection, and began following the footprints from the day before. They led deeper into the forest, winding through thick underbrush and over small hills. The further I went, the more unsettled I became. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me freeze. I began noticing other signs. Flattened patches of grass, broken branches, and areas where the earth seemed disturbed. Whoever or whatever had been moving around the cabin was still here. They had to be. I spent hours tracking them, careful not to make too much noise, careful not to leave my own tracks too obviously. The sun was high by the time I realized something crucial. These tracks were not from a human. They were from someone, yes, but their gait was irregular, unnatural. The steps were sometimes wide, sometimes small, and the depth of the prints indicated significant weight at times and almost none at others, as if the person was moving carefully, deliberately, trying not to leave evidence. Panic rose in my chest. I had come out here to be alone, but I hadn't expected this kind of isolation, the kind where being alone made me a target rather than a sanctuary. That evening, I fortified the cabin further. I stacked heavier logs against the door, wedged a chair under the handle, and tied ropes to the railing that could serve as a tripwire or alert if someone tried to enter. I moved my sleeping bag closer to the fireplace so I could stay in a safer position and kept my knife in my hand while the fire burned. The wind continued to howl, but I noticed it had a rhythm that seemed to hide other noises. Footsteps, dragging sounds, soft rustles that I would have missed if I hadn't been listening carefully. The next days were a strange mixture of fear and routine. I went out only during daylight hours, always with the stick in hand, always checking for footprints and signs. At night, I stayed inside, alert, monitoring the perimeter as best as I could. Food became scarce faster than expected because I avoided venturing too far into the forest, and I realized that my isolation had turned from peaceful solitude to careful survival. I was learning to listen, to notice small details. The pattern of the wind, the noises of birds signaling danger, the sound of my own breathing in contrast to everything outside. The tension was exhausting, but I kept my focus sharp. One afternoon, I noticed a fresh pile of footprints much closer to the cabin than before. Someone had been right at the edge of the clearing, maybe observing me. My pulse quickened, but I knew panicking would be worse. I gathered a small bag with essentials: water, food, my knife, a first aid kit, and a flashlight, and prepared a plan to leave the area. The nearest town was still far, but there was a dirt road that connected to the main highway. I memorized the path carefully, tracing it in my mind, and made sure I could navigate it even if the forest seemed disorienting. That night, I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting, preparing. The sounds outside were closer than ever, but I did not leave the fire unattended. At around 3 a.m., the noises escalated. Scratches against the wood, thumps against the walls, and a low scraping that seemed like deliberate testing. My heart pounded, but I stayed calm, breathing steadily. I waited for the first light. When dawn finally arrived, I made my move. I left quietly, avoiding the open clearing as much as possible, and followed the faint path toward the dirt road. The forest seemed endless, but I stayed focused. I didn't look back until I reached the first bend in the road, and even then I was careful. The tracks that had haunted me for days were still visible near the cabin, but I didn't see anyone. The relief was cautious. I knew they could be hiding, observing, but at that moment, I felt a measure of safety and distance. I walked the rest of the way to the main road, exhausted, my legs shaking, my muscles sore. When I reached the highway, I flagged down a passing car, and the driver took me to the nearest town. The police were skeptical at first, but I provided the cabin location and described the tracks and signs I had seen. A search was conducted, but nothing unusual was found. Only the cabin, abandoned and silent. The tracks had vanished, the forest quiet. I never returned to that cabin. The experience stayed with me, vivid and raw. I had gone seeking solitude and found something much darker: the vulnerability of being alone in a vast, indifferent wilderness. I learned to respect the isolation, to understand the fine line between freedom and danger. Every time I think of that place, I remember the small signs, the noises that set my nerves on edge, the heavy weight of being watched without ever seeing a person. It was real, and it was terrifying, but I survived because I stayed alert, because I respected the signs, and because I did not let fear make me careless. That cabin taught me the value of preparation, the importance of observation, and the necessity of respect for places where nature and human solitude intersect. I can still picture the creek, the forest, and the cabin in my mind, the serene beauty of it intertwined with the lingering tension of those nights. I remember feeling the wind on my face, smelling the pine, hearing the faint rustle of something unseen, and knowing that danger can exist even when nothing supernatural or fantastical is involved. The experience ended, and I came back to safety, carrying the lesson with me. Being alone can be peaceful, but it can also be dangerously real, and surviving it requires calm, careful, and deliberate action. I had been driving for hours along the winding back roads of the northern forest. The air outside was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the sun had begun to dip low behind the dense treeline. My plan had been simple: a weekend alone in a remote cabin, far from the city, far from anyone who might bother me. I had been longing for the quiet, the solitude, the chance to just sit and listen to the world without noise. I knew I wouldn't be completely alone. There were other cabins in the area, but the nearest neighbor was more than a mile away. That distance, I thought, would be enough to give me the feeling of being truly alone, which was what I wanted. The road narrowed as I turned off the main highway, the pavement giving way to packed dirt that had deep grooves from the tires of trucks that had passed before me. I slowed my car, careful not to hit the rocks that jutted out of the edges, and the forest closed in so tightly that my headlights barely made a dent in the darkness. The sun was gone now, replaced by a faint orange glow on the horizon that would soon disappear completely. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a small thrill of relief. It was tucked into a slight depression in the land, almost hidden by a stand of thick fir trees. The structure was simple: a single story, made of rough-hewn logs with a peaked roof and a chimney that looked as if it hadn't been used in some time. The porch sagged slightly, and a few of the windows were streaked with dirt. It was exactly what I had imagined. Remote, quiet, and entirely mine for the weekend. I parked my car near the edge of the small clearing, shut it off, and stepped into the chilly air. The smell of wet wood and moss filled my nose, and I felt an immediate sense of calm. The first thing I did was check the cabin. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small room with a low ceiling. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the last bits of daylight streaming through the windows. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, a small kitchen area with a sink and cabinets, and a single table with 2 chairs. I walked through the room slowly, checking the doors and windows. Everything seemed intact, though some of the floorboards creaked under my weight. I made a mental note to be careful at night. After I unpacked, I started a fire in the stove. The smell of burning would fill the cabin, and I sat back in a chair with my backpack still at my feet, listening to the forest as darkness settled over the land. Outside, I could hear the wind rustling the trees and the occasional snap of a branch. I told myself it was just the wind, nothing more. But even as I thought that, a part of me remained aware that I was alone, really alone, in a place where help would not come quickly if I needed it. That thought was unnerving, but I brushed it aside, telling myself I had chosen this. Night fell fully, and the forest became a solid wall of darkness outside my windows. The fire in the stove crackled and popped, sending sparks into the metal tray beneath it. I moved closer to it, warming my hands, trying to shake the creeping unease that comes from being somewhere so isolated. I decided to check the perimeter, making sure the doors were locked. As I walked around the outside, the shadows cast by my flashlight stretched unnaturally across the ground. Every rustle, every whisper of wind sounded sharper, closer, more intentional than it should have. I shook my head and laughed softly at myself, but I could feel my pulse quicken. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't before. There were tracks in the mud near the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought they were from a deer or another animal, but as I knelt down to look more closely, I realized they were human footprints. They led from the treeline toward the cabin and then stopped just short of the porch. My heart rate spiked. I knew the cabin was supposed to be empty. I had checked it. I had seen no signs of anyone else being there. I went back inside, locked the doors, and looked around carefully. Nothing had moved, nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was probably just someone walking through the area earlier in the day, maybe a hiker. Still, the thought that someone had been close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to see me inside, made my skin crawl. I tried to focus on the fire, on the soft orange glow it gave off, on the way the smoke curled up the chimney. I told myself I was safe, that the nearest road was far enough away that anyone approaching would have to make a lot of noise. Sleep did not come easily that night. I kept listening to the forest, every snap of a branch making me sit up straight. At one point, I thought I heard voices, but the wind shifted and carried them away. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it was just my imagination. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slept lightly, one ear attuned to every sound outside. Started around midnight, a scraping sound, low and deliberate, coming from outside the cabin. It moved along the walls, stopping at the windows, moving again, slow and heavy. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I stayed frozen, listening. Then came the footsteps, heavy on the porch, moving around as if someone was inspecting the cabin from all sides. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. I just listened, the knife clutched in my hand, ready to defend myself if necessary. The sounds continued for hours, fading and returning in irregular patterns, until finally, sometime before dawn, they stopped. The next morning, I left the cabin. Not immediately, but I packed quietly, carefully, as if making a single noise could bring it all back. Outside, the forest seemed almost normal, birds calling, leaves rustling, but I knew it wasn't normal. The ground around the cabin was disturbed. Footprints, too large to be mine, too deliberate to be an animal's, circled the cabin, coming close to the doors and windows. then disappearing into the forest. I took pictures with my phone. Not that there was any way to call for help, just for proof. Proof of what I didn't know. But I wanted to see it later, away from the isolation, where I could make sense of it. I stayed another night, though reluctantly. I built the fire higher, reinforced the doors and windows more thoroughly, and slept with the knife at my side. I didn't hear the footsteps that night, but I didn't sleep well. Every sound woke me, every shadow made me flinch. I was constantly aware, constantly alert, and by the time morning came, I was completely drained. The third day, I decided to leave entirely. I packed everything, double-checked the cabin, and took pictures of the footprints again. As I drove down the mountain road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The forest looked empty, quiet, normal, but the sense of being watched stayed with me. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, hundreds of miles away from the cabin. In the weeks after, I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia. That isolation, that darkness, that silence, it plays tricks on the mind. But I kept thinking about those footprints, circling the cabin, heavy and deliberate. I kept thinking about the scraping, the slow, careful footsteps on the porch. And I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been there, observing me, and that they were still out there. I never returned to the cabin. The thought of going back, of being in that isolation again, with the possibility that the person or people who had been watching me were still around, was unbearable. I sold the property to someone else. I told them it was remote, peaceful, isolated. I didn't tell them about the footsteps, the sounds, the feeling of being watched. Couldn't. Sometimes, though, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear a sound. A floorboard creak, a branch against the window, and I remember the cabin. I remember the darkness pressing in, the silence that wasn't empty, the footprints circling outside, and I realized that the real fear wasn't being alone. It was knowing that someone else had been there, waiting, watching, and that they could still be out there, somewhere in the forest, patient, silent, unseen. Even now, years later, I avoid cabins. I avoid remote places. I avoid being alone in the wilderness. And when I drive past a forest, especially in the mountains, I can't help but glance at the trees, scanning for something moving among them. I tell myself it's irrational. I tell myself it's paranoia, but I know better. I know that the fear I felt in that cabin was real, and I know that some things are real enough to stay with you forever, even if you never see them again. The cabin, the forest, the isolation. It taught me that real terror isn't in ghosts or monsters or fairy tales. It's in other people, in the unseen, in the knowledge that someone else might be out there, quietly waiting, and that you might never know until it's too late. And that knowledge, that uncertainty, is enough to keep you awake at night for the rest of your life. It started on a gray morning when I decided to escape the city for a while. I had found a small cabin listed online, tucked deep into the mountains far from any towns or busy roads. The pictures made it look perfect. A small wooden structure surrounded by thick pine forest, a creek nearby, and a dirt path leading up to the door. I needed a break from work, from the constant noise and demands, and the idea of solitude in the wilderness seemed like the right choice. I packed my bag carefully, double-checking my flashlight, my food, and my basic supplies, and drove until the asphalt ended and the gravel road began, winding up the mountainside. The drive was long. The air changed as I climbed higher, cooler and cleaner, and the traffic slowly vanished until there was nothing but my car and the distant hum of insects. I arrived just as the sun was starting to tilt low in the sky. The cabin was even smaller than I expected, more basic than it looked online, but that added to its charm. It had a wooden porch with a rickety railing, a few chairs stacked against the wall, and windows covered in a fine layer of dust. I parked in the small clearing in front and got out, letting the air fill my lungs. The scent of pine and damp earth was strong, clean, and oddly calming. I spent the first hour just walking around the cabin, examining the surroundings. The creek nearby bubbled softly over rocks, the water clear and cold. A small path led into the forest, and I could see deer tracks in the soft dirt. Felt peaceful. I felt isolated, but in a good way, as if I could finally breathe without anyone else around. I brought in my bags and started unpacking, placing food in the small refrigerator, stacking firewood neatly next to the stone fireplace, and arranging my sleeping bag and supplies on the floor. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, and no electricity except for the small generator outside, which I planned to run only when necessary. I liked the idea of being completely disconnected. The first night was quiet but not entirely comfortable. The wind moved through the trees, making the branches scrape against the cabin walls. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I went to the window, there was nothing. Only the long shadows of trees stretching across the ground. I told myself it was my imagination. I was alone, yes, but that didn't mean there was anything truly dangerous. I had locked the door, checked the windows, and made sure everything was secure. Still, my mind kept jumping at sounds I couldn't identify. I spent the next day exploring. I walked along the creek, climbed small hills, and traced animal tracks, observing squirrels and birds in the trees. I collected some dry wood for the fireplace and some larger branches that could serve as extra support if needed. The forest was thick, and I could feel how easy it would be to get lost if I ventured too far. I marked the trail with small pieces of cloth tied around tree branches, just in case I needed to retrace my steps. Everything felt safe, though, and I allowed myself to relax more as the day passed. It was on the third night that things started to feel different. I had been outside late, collecting more wood for the fire because the nights were colder than I had expected. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, and I felt the first true sense of being watched. It was a subtle feeling, a prickling at the back of my neck, like someone was standing just beyond the edge of vision. I shook it off and returned to the cabin. Inside, I double-checked the locks, started the fire, and poured a cup of water. The orange glow of the flames was comforting, but the wind outside was picking up, howling through the trees. I heard the first loud noise around midnight, a sharp, heavy thump on the side of the cabin. My heart jumped, and I froze, straining to hear more. Then another thump, followed by a scraping sound, like something dragging along the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and my small pocket knife. The beam of light cut through the darkness outside the window, but there was nothing. Only shadows, only the shaking branches, only the wind pushing through the trees. I stayed inside for hours, moving from window to window, listening for more sounds, trying to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had come close. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe the cabin's old wood was shifting in the wind. The next day, I discovered some evidence that made me uneasy. Near the edge of the clearing, in the soft dirt, were fresh footprints. They were larger than mine, but not human in the sense of being shaped like a normal boot. They had a strange, uneven pattern, as if someone or something had been moving carefully, deliberately, around the cabin. I followed them a short distance into the trees, but they disappeared where the undergrowth was thick. My stomach tightened. I had not expected anyone else to be out here. The cabin was remote, and the nearest town was at least an hour's drive down the mountain. I told myself to stay calm. I reinforced the door, checked the windows again, and made a more organized pile of firewood near the entrance so I could see if anyone approached. I did not see anyone that day. The forest seemed quieter, the wind more insistent, but still, nothing concrete. By nightfall, I had a small sense of false security. Maybe I was imagining things, I thought. Maybe it was just the wild. But that night, the sounds came back. Louder this time, closer, more deliberate. Thumps, dragging sounds, snapping twigs. It was like something or someone was moving around the cabin, pacing, testing the boundaries. I didn't sleep. I stayed near the fireplace, flashlight in hand, listening. The wind was loud, the fire crackling, and then, at some point, the noises stopped, abruptly. That silence was worse than the noise. It was waiting. I didn't know for how long I stayed awake, but by the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, my muscles were stiff, my eyes sore, and my mind exhausted. I sat up, clutching the lantern, considering my options. There was a small hunting knife in my backpack, but no gun. I could try to wait it out, hope the person or animal was just passing by, or I could barricade the doors and windows. My instincts screamed at me to do both. I grabbed a thick chair from the living area and pushed it against the front door, then used a heavy metal pot to block the window latch. Every shadow on the walls made my mind race. Every noise outside, the scratch of a branch, a thump on the porch, the skittering of something small, felt amplified 100 times. I sat huddled near the fire, knife in hand, eyes darting to every corner of the room. Hours passed like this, the fear never letting up. Sleep was impossible. My stomach ached from tension, my hands trembled, and my ears were raw from straining to hear the smallest movement outside. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved to see daylight filtering through the windows. The steps had stopped sometime in the night. I spent the next day preparing. I cleared brush near the cabin, made sure the firewood was stacked near the entrance, and even tied a few logs together to create a makeshift barrier outside. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to move in my peripheral vision. I checked my phone frequently, though there was still no service, and I made a rough mental map of escape routes should I need them. I realized I could not stay in one place passively if someone or something was stalking the area. On the third night, the wind picked up again, shaking the cabin. I had decided to sleep with the knife within reach and the lantern on, even though it woke me every time it flickered. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch. This time, they were accompanied by a low, dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled along the ground. My heart raced uncontrollably. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The steps moved along the front of the cabin, stopping just out of view of the windows. Then came scratching, loud and urgent, as if someone was trying to pry open the door. Panic overtook me. I grabbed the chair and slammed it against the door, wedging it as hard as I could. I pressed the knife to my chest, ready to act, but the sound stopped. Silence. Then, faintly, I heard movement retreating into the forest. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. I sat there for hours waiting until finally, exhausted, I fell into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I cautiously went outside. The porch was damaged. Scratches on the wood, deep gouges in the frame of the door, the metal latch bent. Someone had tried to force their way in. My heart sank. I realized the danger was real and that I had narrowly avoided a confrontation. I packed carefully, taking only what I could carry. I left the firewood, the cooking supplies, everything else, and started down the trail toward the road. Every few minutes, I paused to listen, half expecting someone to appear from the trees, but the forest was silent except for the distant rush of a creek. It was slow going, the mud still heavy, the clouds threatening rain again. I kept my eyes on the trail, scanning for any sign of the intruder, moving as quietly as I could while also maintaining speed. Hours passed. Eventually, I reached the gravel parking lot. My car was exactly where I had left it, and I felt an overwhelming wave of relief. I locked the doors and sat for a moment, shaking, trying to collect myself. As I drove down the mountain, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. The city skyline appeared in the distance, a sign of safety, human life, and the ordinary world. I resolved never to return to that cabin, never to seek isolation in such a remote place again. The experience had shown me that the forest could be beautiful, but also dangerous, and that the real fear came not from shadows or imagination, but from the very real presence of other people, and the knowledge that they could reach you in your most vulnerable moments. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with law enforcement. They found footprints leading up to the cabin that did not match any wildlife, tool marks on the door, and traces of human activity nearby. A campfire, remnants of food, and discarded clothing. Someone had been living near the cabin, watching it, possibly waiting for me. The police could not find the person, but the evidence confirmed my fears. I had been followed, stalked, and endangered. I realized then that isolation, the very thing I sought for peace, had made me a target. I never stayed alone in the woods again. I still hike, still visit cabins, but always with company or with full communication devices. I learned the hard way that the wilderness does not forgive mistakes, that even a well-built cabin is no protection if someone is determined to find you, and that fear is not just imagined in the dark. It is real, and it can save your life if you respect it. The forest is beautiful, quiet, and serene, but it is also home to dangers that are very real, and the memory of that night, the footsteps, and the scratches on the cabin door will never leave me. I carry it with me, not as a story of ghosts or shadows, but as a lesson in vigilance, survival, and the limits of solitude. I had been planning the trip for months, picking a cabin far away from anyone, tucked into the deep woods where the only signs of life were the trees and the occasional birds. I had imagined the cabin as a peaceful escape, a place to disconnect from the constant noise and pressure of my life in the city. The brochures had shown it as a rustic, isolated place with creaky wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and a small porch that overlooked a pond surrounded by thick forest. I wanted solitude, and for a while I thought it would be perfect. I drove for hours along winding roads, watching the city dissolve behind me, replaced by vast stretches of forest and the occasional patch of farmland. The GPS was sketchy, dropping me onto gravel paths that turned into dirt trails. Every mile I traveled felt like a mile deeper into silence. Eventually, I came to a fork in the road. One path was overgrown and looked like it hadn't been used in years. The other was narrower but appeared maintained. I chose the maintained path, feeling a little tension in my chest as I drove slowly over ruts and uneven ground. When I arrived at the cabin, the late afternoon sun was beginning to fade behind the tall pines. The cabin looked exactly like it had in the photos, maybe even more worn and real. There was no one around, no neighbors, no cars, no sound except the wind in the trees. The air smelled clean and sharp, with a faint hint of wet earth and pine needles. I parked near the cabin, noticing that the dirt around the door looked freshly trampled, though I didn't see anyone. I shrugged it off. Maybe a ranger or a hiker had been here recently. I unloaded my things and started settling in. The cabin had the faint smell of wood smoke and dust. I opened the windows to let in the cool evening air and the sounds of the forest. Birds were quieting down, and the wind moved through the branches with a soft rustle. I decided to start a fire in the fireplace. The wood was stacked neatly inside, dry and ready. As the flames took hold, I sank into the old armchair near the fire, feeling the warmth seep into my chest. I thought about dinner, about a simple meal of canned soup and bread, but I was too tired to cook anything elaborate. I sat back and let myself relax, listening to the fire crackle. The first night passed quietly. I woke a few times to strange noises outside, branches snapping, a rustling through the undergrowth, but I told myself it was just animals. Deer, maybe raccoons or squirrels. I had read that bears could roam in these woods, but I assumed the cabin was far enough from dense feeding areas that I didn't have to worry. The next morning, I explored the immediate area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail leading from the porch down to the pond. The water was still and dark, reflecting the gray sky. The forest around it was thick, dense, and quiet except for the occasional bird call. I walked slowly, noting every detail. The way the leaves crunched under my boots, the smell of wet earth and decaying vegetation, the sound of a log settling in the water. I thought about fishing or just sitting there for hours, reading or thinking. I noticed a few things that unsettled me slightly. The trail didn't seem maintained past the pond, as if it disappeared into the woods, but I had thought the cabin was supposed to be completely private. I saw some footprints in the dirt, human footprints, leading toward the cabin but not away from it. They weren't mine. I studied them carefully. They were fresh, maybe a few hours old. My stomach sank, but I told myself it could have been hikers passing by earlier, or maybe a local checking the property. Still, I made sure to lock the door behind me when I returned. The days passed with small, uneasy moments. I would hear more rustling at night, sometimes long, deliberate cracks, like someone stepping on branches. Sometimes I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree line, a flash of color or a shadow. I kept my distance, not leaving the cabin unless I had to. I started keeping the windows locked, the doors double-checked, even though there had been no direct threat yet. On the third night, things escalated. I was in the living area, reading a book by firelight, when I heard a sharp knock at the door. Not a bang, not a dull thud, but a clear, deliberate knock. I froze, heart thudding. I didn't know if I should investigate. The door was locked, I reminded myself, but the knock came again, a bit harder this time, followed by the sound of something scraping against the wood outside. My stomach turned. I considered calling the local authorities, but my phone had no signal. The next morning, I woke to the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. The fire had died overnight, leaving the cabin cold. I dressed quickly and went outside to check the surroundings in the daylight. The tracks were still there, clearer now in the soft morning light. They led from the treeline to the porch, exactly where I had seen them the night before. But now I could see additional prints. They had gone around the cabin to the back and then disappeared into the forest. Whoever had been there had circled the cabin completely. My unease deepened. I decided to stay near the cabin during the day. I kept a hatchet nearby, and I made a small perimeter around the clearing, noting the best places to see anyone approaching. Hours passed, slow and tense. The forest was alive with birds and squirrels, the wind moving through the treetops. I tried to focus on the mundane tasks, cleaning the cabin, chopping firewood, preparing food, but a part of me stayed alert. Every shadow, every movement at the edge of my vision made me jump. That evening, as the sun began to set again, I noticed movement in the trees. A figure appeared briefly, tall and human-shaped, and then vanished behind a trunk. My heart pounded. I had no doubt now that someone was out there watching the cabin. I secured all the doors and windows, placed heavy objects against them where I could, and sat with the hatchet in my hands. I could hear them moving around outside, slow, careful, deliberate. Hours passed. I stayed awake the entire night, watching the small circle of light cast by my lantern inside the cabin. Outside, I could hear them sometimes stopping, moving, and then stopping again. Every time I thought I caught a glimpse, it was gone before I could confirm it. I felt trapped, isolated, and vulnerable. The fear was different from anything I had felt before. It was not the fear of danger in a story or a movie. It was real, palpable, and immediate. Morning came, and I realized I needed to leave. I couldn't stay another night with someone watching me, someone who might be waiting for me to make a mistake. I packed quickly, grabbing the essentials, keeping the hatchet within reach. I double-checked the cabin, making sure the doors were secure behind me, then stepped out into the cold morning air. The forest was quiet now, but I could see tracks leading away from the cabin toward the dirt road. I followed them carefully, moving toward my car, constantly scanning the trees. It took hours to get back to the highway, moving slowly and deliberately through the undergrowth, making as little noise as possible. I avoided open spaces, sticking to areas where I could see long distances but also where I could hide if needed. When I finally reached the dirt road, I ran the last few hundred meters to my car, sliding in and locking the doors immediately. I didn't start the engine right away, just sat there, listening to the silence, watching the forest. Eventually, I started the car and drove slowly back to the highway. I didn't stop until I reached a small town where I could see people, cars, signs of life. I felt a wave of relief that I hadn't felt since I first parked at the cabin. I pulled into a motel, checked in, and spent the rest of the day in the safety of a room full of strangers. Looking back, I know I was lucky. I don't know who had been watching the cabin, how long they had been there before I arrived, or what their intentions were. But the experience changed the way I think about isolation and vulnerability. I will never take a remote cabin for granted again. I now understand that being truly alone in the wilderness is not just a peaceful escape. It can be dangerous, and sometimes you don't know exactly what you are up against. Even now, months later, I can still see the prints in the mud, hear the crunch of leaves under footsteps that might have been mine, and feel the fear that comes from knowing someone has been closer to you than you realized. I still go hiking, still seek quiet places, but I am far more cautious. I check the perimeter, I watch for movement, and I remind myself that being alone is not always the same as being safe. The lesson I learned that weekend is one I carry with me every time I step into the forest. and it is a lesson I will never forget. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted to get away from the city, from the noise and the constant movement, from the sense that everyone around me was constantly rushing towards something I couldn't even name. I rented a small cabin in the middle of the woods, somewhere far from the nearest road. The pictures online made it look perfect. A wooden cabin with a stone chimney, a small porch, a fire pit out back, and a river not far away. I didn't care about cell service or electricity. I wanted isolation. I wanted to be alone with nothing but the forest and my own thoughts. The drive there was long, but I didn't mind. I left early in the morning, when the air was still damp and cold from the night. The roads became narrower and less maintained as I drove deeper into the forest. I passed old barns, abandoned houses, and stretches of road where I couldn't see another car for miles. Eventually, the road turned to gravel, then dirt, and finally there was a narrow trail just wide enough for one car. At this point, I realized I hadn't seen another soul in over an hour, and I felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because I knew I was truly alone. Unease because it reminded me how small and exposed I was out here. When I arrived at the cabin, the sun was already high. The cabin looked exactly like it did in the pictures, though smaller than I expected. It had a simple wooden door and a small porch with a creaking swing. I parked my car and carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and pine. Dust coated the corners of the rooms, and the windows were slightly fogged. There was a kitchen with a small stove, a table, and a few chairs, a living area with a worn couch, and a single bedroom with a small bed. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. I could hear the river faintly in the distance, and the occasional bird or rustle of leaves. The first day passed slowly. I unpacked, explored the area, and made a small fire outside. I cooked some food, drank water from a bottle I brought, and watched the forest as the sun dipped lower. The isolation was comforting. I had no schedule, no expectations, no one to answer to. I felt free in a way I hadn't felt in years. But as night fell, I noticed how dark the woods became. Shadows stretched across the ground, and the trees swayed silently in the wind. I told myself it was normal, that this was just the natural quiet of the forest, but I felt a flicker of tension in my chest. I went to bed early that night. The cabin was cold, and I had only a thin blanket, but it was enough. The wind rattled the windows and the branches tapped against the walls, creating a constant background noise. At first, I slept lightly, hearing every creak and groan of the old cabin. Then, around midnight, I woke. At first, I thought I had just dreamed it, but then I heard it again. A snapping sound, like a branch breaking, very close to the cabin. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by another. Something was moving out there. My mind raced, imagining deer, raccoons, bears, but the sounds were too deliberate, too heavy for an animal. I stayed in bed for what felt like hours, listening. The sounds moved around the cabin, circling it, stopping and starting at different points. I wanted to grab a flashlight, to open the door, to see, but every instinct told me to stay put. The night seemed to stretch endlessly. Eventually, the noises stopped, and I finally fell into a shallow, restless sleep. The next day, I tried to calm myself. I went for a walk along the river, noting the tracks on the muddy banks. There were footprints, large, booted human footprints. I traced them back toward the cabin. My stomach twisted. I had been alone, or at least I thought I had been. Someone had been near the cabin during the night. I tried to reason it out, maybe hikers, maybe hunters. But the thought that someone had been close enough to hear me sleeping made me feel exposed, vulnerable. I spent the next few hours making small changes to feel safer. I gathered firewood, barricaded the cabin door with a heavy chair, and moved the swing to block the porch entrance. I checked my phone, but of course there was no signal. I could see the fear starting to creep in, but I refused to let it take over. I told myself that daylight was my ally, that the forest was safer in the sun. I remember the first time I decided to go completely alone into the mountains. I had been working non-stop for months in the city, dealing with long hours, loud noises, and a small apartment that felt like a cage. The idea of disappearing into silence, even for a few days, was too tempting to pass up. I found a cabin online, remote enough to feel isolated but still reachable by a rough dirt road. The photos made it look welcoming, rustic, and solid enough that it felt safe, even if it was deep in the wilderness. I had the money to rent it for a week, and I told myself this would be a reset. A chance to breathe, to escape from people, from traffic, from everything. I packed my car carefully, more than I needed, because I couldn't imagine what I might need in such isolation. Food, water, firewood, blankets, a first aid kit, some extra clothing, a few books, and my camera. I thought of nothing else. The drive was long, longer than I expected. The city fell behind. The highways gave way to twisting mountain roads lined with thick pine trees, and the air began to smell of damp soil and leaves. By the time I reached the small gravel road leading to the cabin, the sun was low, casting an orange glow across the forest. The trees towered overhead, dense and unmoving, and the air was silent except for the occasional bird. I parked my car at the start of the driveway and looked at the cabin in the fading light. It was smaller than I imagined, a simple wooden structure with a small porch and smoke stains near the chimney. The windows were dusty but intact, and the door seemed sturdy. I felt a thrill. This was exactly what I wanted, being completely alone, and the cabin looked strong enough to withstand anything nature could throw at me. I unpacked slowly, putting things in their places. The cabin smelled faintly of mildew and wood, a smell I immediately associated with old places that had been neglected. I didn't mind. It felt authentic. The firewood was stacked neatly near the fireplace, the stove looked functional, and the sink had a small amount of running water. I set up my small space, placing my sleeping bag on the floor near the wood stove and arranging my supplies on the kitchen counter. By the time I finished, it was dark outside, the forest a wall of black around me. I lit the stove and then a small lantern, the flickering light pushing back shadows in the corners. The silence was thick, not the soft quiet of a library, but a deep, heavy quiet that made every creak of the cabin noticeable. Every groan of the wood seemed louder than it should be, and I realized quickly that I was not used to hearing only myself. I ate a simple dinner, bread, canned beans, and water, and then decided to go for a short walk around the property before it got too dark. The moon was rising, small and pale behind thin clouds, casting faint light over the uneven ground. I walked slowly, trying to take in everything. The trees were thick, the forest floor covered in pine needles, rocks, and roots that caught at my boots. At first, I felt calm, almost peaceful, listening to the wind rustle through the branches. Then I noticed the deer tracks, fresh in the soft earth, leading off toward the deeper woods. A shiver ran down my spine, not from fear, but from the realization that the forest was alive, and I was alone in it. The night was colder than I expected. Back in the cabin, I lit the stove fully, enjoying the crackle of fire and the warmth that slowly spread across the room. I unpacked a few books and sat near the stove, reading by the light of the lantern. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through gaps in the cabin's walls, rattling the windows. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the pages, but the sound of something moving outside caught my attention. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A snapping of a branch, deliberate and soft, too consistent to be random. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or a fox, but my heart beat faster than usual. I kept checking the windows. My imagination made shadows dance on the trees, and I started noticing shapes that weren't there. I slept poorly that night, waking up every hour at the smallest noise, imagining someone, or something, was moving through the forest just beyond my vision. Morning came slowly, gray and overcast, and I felt drained. I packed a small backpack and decided to explore the trails near the cabin, hoping the daylight would ease my nerves. The trails were steep and uneven. Rocks, roots, and mud made each step precarious. I kept my eyes on the ground and the surrounding forest, constantly scanning for movement. Birds called occasionally, and I saw squirrels darting through the branches, but nothing else. I tried to enjoy it, to notice the small things. The smell of pine, the occasional patch of moss, the way the fog hung low in the hollows. I kept a small pocket knife in my hand, just in case, and kept telling myself that everything was fine, that I was imagining things. By the third day, the isolation was beginning to weigh on me. I could feel my mind stretching thin. I hadn't seen another person in more than 2 days. My phone barely had signal, and I had no way to call out except for a short window near the top of the hill. I was careful with supplies now, rationing food and water. Sleep was still difficult. Every night, the noises outside, the branches, the wind, small animals, kept me alert. I started hearing things that weren't there. At least I couldn't see them. Scratches, thumps, whispers of movement too faint to identify. I reminded myself that in the forest, small animals caused most noises, but still I felt watched. On the fourth day, I decided to chop firewood outside, wanting to clear my mind and get some physical activity. The axe felt heavy, but the work was satisfying. I noticed tracks around the cabin, too big for a dog, maybe a wild animal. Bear, perhaps? I stayed close to the cabin, axe in hand, listening for signs of life. The forest seemed quieter than usual. That evening, I cooked a small meal and kept the stove going long after eating. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the smallest noise. I had been planning this trip for months. After a long year of work, endless deadlines, and the constant noise of the city, I needed to be somewhere quiet, isolated, and untouched. Somewhere I could disappear for a while, with nothing but the trees, the wind, and the sound of my own breathing. I found a small cabin listed online, far up in the mountains with no neighbors for miles. It was simple, wooden, a single room with a tiny kitchen, a loft for sleeping, and a fireplace. No electricity, no phone reception, no internet. Perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. The drive up was long and winding. I remember every turn because the roads were narrow and steep, surrounded by thick forest. The sky was overcast, and as I climbed higher, the clouds seemed to settle lower on the trees, making the forest feel like it was closing in around me. The cabin itself was tucked away at the end of a dirt path, barely visible until I drove almost past it. It was older than I expected. The wood was dark and weathered, the roof sagging slightly, but it looked sturdy enough, and that was all I cared about. I parked, unloaded my things, and took the first few steps onto the creaking wooden porch. The air was sharp and cold, and it smelled like pine and damp earth. I set my backpack down, trying to ignore the sense of being completely alone. Inside, the cabin smelled musty, like old wood and years of neglect. Dust clung to the corners, and the floorboards creaked with every step. The furniture was sparse. A small table with a few chairs, a worn-out armchair, a metal stove in the corner, and a bed on the loft above. The windows were thick and small, letting in little light. I unpacked slowly, making sure everything was in place. I had brought canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, and blankets. I also brought a small first aid kit and a hunting knife just in case. I told myself that was probably overkill, but having it there made me feel slightly safer. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened and a cold wind was blowing. I had lit the small stove and a fire in the fireplace. The flames licked the walls, giving the cabin a warm glow, and for a while, I felt comfortable. I sat on the armchair, sipping water and looking out the small window at the forest. The trees swayed, and the shadows grew longer as the light faded. That's when I first noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no animals, not even the distant sound of water or wind moving through the mountains. Just a total, unnerving silence. The first night was strange. I woke up several times, startled by the sounds outside. Sometimes it was a branch snapping, sometimes it was the wind, but other times it sounded heavier, like footsteps. I knew no one was supposed to be there, yet it felt like something was moving just beyond the edge of my sight. I told myself it was paranoia. The isolation played tricks on the mind. Still, I stayed awake longer than usual, sitting by the fire and listening to the quiet. Eventually, I drifted off, exhausted, but sleep was restless. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, with old pine trees and patches of moss covering the ground. There were deer tracks in the mud, but otherwise no signs of life. I walked for hours, taking in the silence, but the more I walked, the more I felt watched. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow, felt deliberate, like someone or something was following me. I kept telling myself it was animals, that it was the wind, that it was my imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin, sweaty, muddy, and exhausted. I locked the door and bolted the windows. I felt silly for doing it, but I couldn't shake the sensation that someone had been watching me all day. That evening, I noticed something else. The food I had left on the table had been moved slightly. Not much, just a few cans shifted a few inches, but I had been careful when I set them down. I stared at them for a long time, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. Still, I couldn't. I checked the locks on the doors and windows again, and even reinforced the boards against the windows with a chair. I went to bed with the knife under my pillow, fully expecting to hear something during the night. And I did.